Hello, my dear friends. People still think Victorian women were pampered like goddesses, but few know that they were abandoned, bleeding, and curled up in mouldy sheets after each lovemaking session. The intimacy was not gentle but hard, painful, and completely one-sided. No towels, no questions, just fishy smells and gasps. They had no choice, no touching in the way they wanted. Tonight, we will lift the velvet curtain and step into the corrupted world of Victorian sex. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now just dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into the bedroom of an ordinary Victorian couple, the first thing to notice would not be romance, but the smell. It was heavy, damp, and strangely sweet, clinging to every corner of the room. The bed, wide enough for two but rarely aired, was layered with sheets that had not been changed for weeks. In homes where washing took effort, water was cold and privacy was scarce. The idea of fresh bedding was a luxury. Families waited until the stench became unbearable before stripping the bed. Until then, life went on, and so did intimacy. It is almost absurd to think that love was often expressed on a surface so filthy it could have served as a breeding ground for disease. The sheets were not simply stained, they were record books of nights long past. Each mark told of sweat, blood, and other bodily traces left to dry where they fell. Men returned home from work with coal dust on their skin and oil under their nails, collapsing into bed without washing. Women, exhausted from housework and childbearing, lay beside them because it was expected. Between them, the mingled odours of iron, musk, and mildew formed a kind of nightly fog. What seemed to the outside world a respectable union was, in private, an unwashed tangle of flesh and residue. For poorer households, washing bed linens was nearly impossible. Water had to be fetched, boiled, and carried up narrow stairs. Soap was costly, and drying sheets in the cold air took days. In cities thick with soot, clean laundry did not stay clean for long, so couples made peace with the grime. Blankets grew stiff from layers of dried fluids, the texture changing from cloth to crust. When the night came, they lay back on the same patches, unbothered or simply resigned. If we imagine this through modern eyes, it would be like sleeping every night on a towel used after surgery and never once replaced. The body adapted in strange ways. Skin stuck to fabric during summer, peeled away in winter, and infections found easy homes in the damp folds of cloth. Some women developed sores that never healed properly. Others learned to sleep in positions that avoided certain parts of the bed altogether. There was no concept of bacteria, no understanding of hygiene beyond what the nose could detect. Cleanliness was about smell, not science. If something no longer stank, it was considered safe. The mixture of dried sweat, menstrual blood, and semen created a film that trapped dust and insects. Fleas thrived, bedbugs multiplied, and small welts covered the skin of those who slept there. Many blamed these irritations on the air or on fate. In truth, they were sleeping each night in a microcosm of decay. Yet even this was not unusual. In a society that prized appearances, dirt in private spaces was invisible. The parlour might gleam, the curtains might be freshly pressed, but the bed was a silent contradiction, both the centre of respectability and its quiet undoing. Intimacy in such conditions was more duty than pleasure. Women were taught to endure, to lie still, to fulfil what was seen as a wife's responsibility. Their comfort or desire mattered little. Husbands climbed into bed without thinking of cleanliness or consequence. The act itself was mechanical, performed on sheets hardened by residue. In the dark, The rough fabric scraped against skin already irritated. Some described it later as feeling more like an illness than an affection. I can almost picture the scene and feel a quiet pity, not for the filth itself, but for how little anyone seemed to question it. The combination of filth and repetition turned beds into repositories of disease. Urinary infections, skin rashes, and even fevers often began here. Yet when sickness spread, few connected it to the bed. Doctors spoke of bad air, poor diets, or weak constitutions. They did not think to ask when the sheets were last washed. A clean bed was an idea reserved for the rich, those who could afford servants to do the labour. For everyone else, intimacy and infection were simply parts of the same life. Sometimes, women tried to clean only the visible parts. They rubbed the stains with water or vinegar, creating pale halos on the fabric that looked cleaner than they were. But the deeper residue stayed, seeping into the stuffing beneath. Over time, the mattress itself became heavy with moisture and mould. Lying down meant sinking into years of trapped breath and body heat. The smell could cling to skin for hours after leaving the bed. Still, each night, the ritual continued. To those who lived through it, this routine was not shocking. It was ordinary, just as factory smoke blackened lungs and river water spread cholera. The unwashed bed was another hazard folded into daily life. Survival meant endurance. Cleanliness was not moral. Endurance was. Women carried that belief like a badge, convinced that suffering quietly was the mark of a good wife. The home remained outwardly proper, but beneath its layers, everything was rotting slowly. The irony of Victorian morality was that it worshipped purity while ignoring what purity truly meant. A clean soul mattered more than a clean body. To scrub sheets would have seemed frivolous compared to scrubbing sin. So the bed, that private altar of love and reproduction, became instead a place of slow decay. It is difficult not to wonder how many lives were shortened by such simple neglect. At its core, this story of dirty sheets reveals more than just poor hygiene. It exposes the gap between ideals and reality, between the appearance of virtue and the quiet suffering that upheld it. Love in the Victorian home was often buried beneath layers of unwashed fabric, matted hair, and silent obedience. The people who lived in those beds may have believed themselves moral, but their bodies told another truth. The marriage bed, meant to unite two souls, instead became a vessel that preserved their waste and their weariness. It was not cleaned, but used again and again, until the fabric carried years of hidden stories. It is hard to separate disgust from pity when thinking of those rooms, where affection met decay and habit replaced tenderness. The nightly ritual on those stained sheets was both ordinary and grotesque, a quiet reflection of the times. From that mixture of sweat and indifference came more than discomfort. It carried the seeds of deeper pain yet to unfold. In another room, on another night, the neglect would take a different form, one that reached far beyond the sheets and into the very body itself. Intimacy in the Victorian home often began when the day had already worn the body down. Men returned from the streets or factories, their shirts damp with sweat and dust from long hours of labour. Women finished their chores with hands rough from scrubbing, their hair clinging to their necks in the heat of stoves and cramped rooms. When night arrived, there was no thought of bathing, no pause for cleansing. The body was used as it was, covered in the residue of the day. Water was too precious, and heating it was too troublesome. So cleanliness waited for another time that rarely came. It seems almost laughable now that people believed passion could thrive beneath layers of grime, yet for Victorians, this was simply how life was lived. There was a kind of practicality behind the neglect. For most, bathing was a weekly task at best, done quickly and modestly, often in the kitchen with a small tin tub. Warm water was reserved for the children or the sick. Adults used cold water, if any at all, splashing only the face and hands. To immerse the whole body was seen as excessive, even suspicious, as if too much attention to the flesh might suggest moral looseness. The idea of washing before or after intimacy did not exist in common practice. The act itself was considered natural, not something to be prepared for or recovered from. Cleanliness belonged to the daylight hours, while the night held its own quiet decay. The air in the room after such encounters grew heavy and sharp. Sweat, breath, and secretions mingled into a film that settled on the sheets and skin alike. Most couples simply pulled their clothes back on and fell asleep. In the morning, the scent still lingered, a faint sourness that clung to fabric and hair. Some women tried to wipe themselves with old cloths or corners of the sheet, but that only spread the residue further. Few saw this as a problem. To them, discomfort was part of the experience. If we think of this in modern terms, it would be like finishing a workout in a crowded gym and then sleeping all night in the same clothes without washing. The notion of post-intimacy hygiene was foreign. Soap, even when available, was harsh and expensive. Many feared that washing the genitals could cause illness or weaken the body. Doctors warned against excessive bathing, claiming it could upset the balance of humours or lead to infertility. These ideas blended with moral restraint to create a society where filth was tolerated as virtue. A clean body was not associated with purity, but with vanity. To be modest meant to ignore the body as much as possible, even when it cried out for care. The results were predictable. Women developed infections that burned and lingered, their bodies reacting to the constant exposure to bacteria and stale fluids. Men suffered as well, though fewer admitted it. The smell of sweat mixed with the musty scent of unwashed linen until it became a kind of background noise of marriage. No one complained openly. To speak of such things was indecent. The silence around hygiene was as thick as the air in those small, unventilated rooms. I find it strange how something so simple as a basin of water could have spared so much discomfort, yet pride and ignorance kept it out of reach. There was a deeper irony in how Victorians viewed cleanliness. They prized order and respectability, yet their most private acts were shrouded in filth. The same hands that polished the silverware or dusted the piano keys each morning would later touch bodies without once being washed. The contrast was striking, but invisible to those who lived it. The mind separated the cleanliness of the home from the cleanliness of the flesh, as if morality could compensate for neglect. When illness appeared, they blamed the weather, the air, or divine punishment, but never the dirt on their own skin. Within marriage, intimacy had little to do with affection or care. It was an obligation carried out with minimal thought. There were no baths drawn to set the mood, no moments of tenderness afterward. A woman might lie still, her hair damp with sweat, while her husband turned away to sleep. In the morning, both dressed and went about their routines as if nothing had happened. The body's needs were ignored, reduced to a tool for duty and reproduction. Water, the simplest relief, remained untouched in its bucket, cooling overnight beside the bed. Occasionally, in wealthier households, couples had access to larger bathtubs or attendants who could prepare warm water. Yet even among the upper class, bathing was not tied to intimacy. Perfume and powder masked odours more often than washing removed them. Scented oils were dabbed on wrists and necks to disguise the stale smell of bodies that had not seen soap in days. The appearance of refinement mattered more than the truth beneath it. To be clean in public was enough. What happened behind closed doors was invisible and therefore unimportant. For poorer couples, the situation was far worse. Living in crowded tenements with no private water supply, they shared basins and towels with other families. Bathing together was impossible, and privacy was non-existent. A husband might return home reeking of smoke and sweat, and his wife, too tired to protest, would accept his touch in silence. There was no expectation of comfort, only survival. The cycle of work, grime, and fatigue repeated endlessly, broken only by sleep or illness. This neglect of the body mirrored the neglect of emotion. The act of union was stripped of tenderness, leaving only function. To wash was to care, and care was a language few spoke aloud. The dirt became part of the ritual, a shared burden of endurance. The smell, the stickiness, the fatigue, all of it formed the texture of married life. It was not romantic, but it was normal. And within that normality lay the quiet tragedy of a society that mistook repression for virtue. In the stillness of those dark rooms, where bodies cooled without cleansing, disease found easy ground. The very air carried reminders of what had passed. No one looked back. No one thought to wash away the remains of the night. What lingered on skin and fabric was simply life continuing as it always had. The lingering scent of sweat and skin spoke of how little care people gave to their own bodies. The habit of treating filth as normal turned intimacy into something mechanical rather than human. Yet when they tried to hide that stench with perfume, another danger quietly began to take shape. Perfume was a mark of refinement in the Victorian age, a symbol of grace that promised to mask the unpleasant realities of daily life. In crowded towns and dimly lit bedrooms, scent became a substitute for cleanliness. When water was scarce and bathing was considered troublesome, fragrance offered an illusion of purity. Bottles of rose, lavender, or musk sat proudly on dressing tables beside combs and mirrors. For many women, these bottles felt like protection, a way to appear elegant even when the body was not. It is almost comical to think about how the Victorians fought decay, not with soap and water, but with the hope that a stronger smell could defeat a bad one. Perfume in the Victorian world was not delicate. It was thick, heavy, and overwhelming. The air of a room filled with it would sting the nose and linger for hours. The formulas were crude, often mixed with alcohol and animal fats. Applied sparingly, they clung to skin and cloth alike. But some women, desperate to appear fragrant in every sense, began to use it more boldly. Without knowledge of irritation or infection, they applied perfume directly to the most private parts of the body. The intention was to seem desirable, to conceal any trace of sweat or intimacy. What began as vanity soon became pain. After intercourse, when the skin was sensitive and the body raw, perfume offered a false solution. The sharp sting was mistaken for freshness, the burning for cleanliness. In truth, the alcohol and oils caused small wounds that refused to heal. Women whispered of soreness and burning sensations, but few dared to speak plainly. The matter was too shameful to mention. Their husbands rarely noticed, or if they did, they attributed the discomfort to female weakness. If we were to imagine this today, it would be like using household disinfectant instead of soap and calling it luxury skin care. Advertisements at the time did little to discourage the practice. Perfume makers claimed their products could restore purity or invigorate the senses. The language was seductive, and it preyed upon insecurity. In a society obsessed with appearances, a woman's worth was tied to her scent. To smell pleasant was to appear virtuous, clean, and refined. To smell of sweat or the human body was indecent. So they poured, dabbed, and rubbed until fragrance replaced flesh. The ingredients themselves were dangerous. Alcohol dried the skin. Animal musk caused inflammation, and oils extracted with crude solvents carried traces of toxins. The labels gave no warnings. There were no safety standards, no medical advice, only endless suggestions that a woman's fragrance defined her character. The irony was cruel. The same culture that demanded chastity also demanded allure, leaving women trapped between purity and pain. To smell alluring meant risking injury, yet to ignore it meant appearing vulgar. Behind closed doors, the act of applying perfume became a ritual, a few drops on the wrist, a touch at the neck, then a hidden gesture beneath layers of lace and cotton. It was done quickly, quietly, as if scent could erase shame. The perfume did not cleanse, it only musked. Over time, the delicate skin broke, blistered, and scarred. The The faint sweetness of lavender mingled with the sharp scent of infection. Yet few sought help. Doctors were men, and such subjects were unfit for discussion. Suffering in silence was easier than humiliation. I cannot help but think how tragedy often hides behind the most elegant gestures, and how ignorance can turn vanity into torment. Perfume became both shield and weapon. It disguised the truth of bodies that rarely bathed, yet it punished those who used it most. The burning was taken as a sign of effectiveness, the pain a necessary sacrifice for beauty. Some even believed the sting proved purity, that discomfort was the price of being presentable. The misunderstanding was cultural, almost religious, rooted in the belief that the body itself was something to conquer rather than care for. The manufacturers profited easily. Their products were cheap to make and endlessly marketable. The stronger the scent, the more refined it was considered. A few reformers warned of harm, but their voices were small and easily ignored. The Victorian obsession with appearances drowned them out. People preferred illusion to truth. To acknowledge the danger would have meant questioning not just perfume, but the entire system that demanded it. In the stillness of the bedroom, when the act was done and the perfume bottle stood open on the table, the air grew thick again. The scent was meant to cover the residue of sweat and skin, yet it only mixed with it, forming a cloud both sweet and rancid. What lingered was not seduction, but suffocation. Those who lived through it learned to mistake that smell for normalcy. It was the odour of repression dressed as refinement. Fragrance became a language of denial. It told of lives polished on the surface but raw underneath. In the end, the perfume bottles that glimmered so proudly on Victorian vanities were not symbols of beauty, but silent reminders of how far people would go to appear clean without ever being so. The burning scent that once promised purity became another form of decay. It spoke of women trapped between cleanliness and pain, of a society that valued scent over safety. Yet beyond that veil of fragrance, a darker ritual was waiting, one that no amount of perfume could disguise. It was not about scent anymore, but about touch, and the false cure that turned medicine into violation. In the moral order of the Victorian household, marriage was not built on affection but on obligation. The man was the head, the woman the vessel of duty. What happened in the privacy of their bedroom was governed not by desire but by expectation. When a husband reached for his wife, she was not asked whether she wanted him. Her answer had already been given the day she married. Consent was no longer hers to give or withhold. It is bitterly ironic that a society obsessed with virtue found righteousness in acts that ignored the will of its women. A woman's body was considered property, an extension of her husband's rights. Religious sermons spoke of wifely obedience. Medical texts described female reluctance as a natural modesty that must be overcome. Even illness was no refuge. Fever, pain, or exhaustion did not excuse her from duty. Husbands were told that marital rights were God-given, and that resistance was sin. To refuse was rebellion. To endure was piety. The home, celebrated as a sacred space, often became a private battlefield of submission. Many of these women were not fully conscious when it happened. Some lay in bed with headaches from the smoke-filled air, their bodies aching from childbirth or menstruation. Others were asleep when their husbands returned from work, smelling of beer and dust. The act was performed in silence, without tenderness, as routine as locking the door. Women learned to lie still, to breathe evenly, to let it end quickly. If we were to translate this into modern terms, it would be like being punished for not smiling while enduring pain you never agreed to. No law recognized what they endured as of their isolation. The concept of rape within marriage simply did not exist. A husband could not commit such an act against what was legally his. Courts upheld this belief for decades, claiming that by marrying, a woman gave permanent consent. The idea of her body belonging to herself was foreign, even scandalous. The silence surrounding these acts was reinforced by religion, medicine, and social hierarchy. To speak of them was unthinkable. To question them was dangerous. Some women broke under the weight of this obedience. They suffered chronic pain, infections, and bleeding. But these symptoms were dismissed as hysteria or weakness. Doctors prescribed rest, tonics, or prayer. The emotional wounds were deeper still. Nights blurred into one another. A cycle of submission repeated until the body ceased to feel. The mind withdrew to survive, leaving only emptiness behind. I often wonder how many Victorian women lived entire lives without once being asked what they desired, only what they could endure. The hypocrisy of the age was suffocating. In public, women were celebrated as angels of the home, pure and nurturing. In private, they were expected to submit without question. A good wife suffered quietly. The act itself was stripped of pleasure, reduced to ritual. Husbands were encouraged to perform their duty as proof of virility, and wives to receive it as proof of virtue. Intimacy became a transaction of power disguised as morality. It is difficult to picture how common this was. Letters and diaries rarely mention it, but between the lines, the silence speaks loudly. Women wrote of sleepless nights, of exhaustion, of vague marital discomforts. These were polite phrases for a truth they could not name. Even among friends, such topics were avoided. The pain was private, sealed behind lace curtains and polite smiles. When a woman became pregnant soon after a miscarriage or during illness, it was not seen as cruelty, but as the natural course of marriage. Her suffering was her duty, her body the instrument of family and faith. Those who protested risked social ruin. They were called ungrateful, hysterical, or even immoral. The same society that condemned public indecency quietly sanctioned violence in the bedroom. To be a wife was to serve. To be silent was to survive. The lack of understanding about women's health made it worse. Without knowledge of infection or trauma, husbands believed their actions harmless. They thought themselves dutiful, even kind, when they fulfilled their role. Pain was taken as evidence of purity, and indifference as virtue. The moral framework that ruled their lives taught that the body existed for service, not for self. There was no vocabulary for violation, only endurance. The church reinforced the cycle. Sermons spoke of marriage as sacred, of wives submitting as Christ submitted to suffering. Scripture was twisted into justification for domination. The confessional offered no comfort, only the reminder that obedience was holy. Women prayed for strength, not freedom. Some numbed themselves with laudanum or alcohol, seeking sleep they could not otherwise find. The nights that followed were filled with repetition, the slow erosion of will beneath the weight of duty. In the cold logic of Victorian society, what mattered most was appearances. So long as the household seemed peaceful, no one cared what happened behind closed doors. Men boasted of discipline and self-control, yet claimed control of others as their right. Women were praised for gentleness, yet expected to bear cruelty without complaint. Beneath the facade of respectability, the domestic sphere concealed an unspoken violence, one too ordinary to provoke outrage. The tragedy of it all lies in how normal it became. Marital obedience was praised as love, silence mistaken for harmony. The emotional distance between partners grew wider with each unspoken night. What should have been a connection became a ritual of absence. It was not romance, but repetition, not affection, but ownership. And still, society called it virtue. Each unspoken night left behind more than pain. It built a foundation of quiet resentment, of bodies used but never seen, of souls kept alive only by habit. This was the hidden cost of Victorian morality, the suffering made invisible by its own rules. The image of devotion that Victorians cherished was never pure. It was stained by submission, by the quiet suffering of countless women whose names history forgot. They were called dutiful wives, though what they truly were was unseen witnesses to their own erasure. In that silence, another practice was waiting. one that turned supposed healing into humiliation and blurred the line between medicine and violation. In the dim light of Victorian bedrooms, men approached their wives with hands that carried the dirt of the entire day. Those hands had turned doorknobs sticky with soot, grasped coins slick with other people's sweat, and sometimes wiped themselves after relieving their bowels without a thought for soap or water. When night came, they reached out again, this time not for work but for touch. The same fingers that held tools and cleaned boots slipped beneath the sheets, as if nothing about them could harm. It is almost absurd to think that the same society that prized polished shoes cared nothing for clean hands when touching a human body. Cleanliness in Victorian England was a matter of display, not of intimacy. Men washed their faces in the morning and combed their hair, but washing their hands beyond that was unnecessary in their minds. The idea that unseen dirt could cause harm was foreign to them. Germ theory was still young, and many dismissed it as superstition. What could not be seen could not be feared. A husband might return from work with grime packed beneath his nails, sit down to dinner, and then go to bed without once touching a basin of water. The boundary between the filth of the street and the sanctity of the home was only an illusion. The result of this ignorance was predictable. Women suffered quietly from infections that doctors could not explain. Burning pain, fever, and discharge became common, and yet few connected them to the nightly ritual of unwashed hands. Husbands assumed their wives were weak, fragile, or sickly by nature. Some even accused them of being unclean, unaware that the cause of their suffering came from the dirt they themselves carried. If we imagine this now, it would be like a surgeon walking from the stable straight into the operating room, proud of his discipline but blind to his own contamination. Soap was available, but not respected. To many men, washing was feminine, unnecessary, even effeminate. They believed that a real man's strength came from labour, from dirt earned through effort. The stains on their hands were marks of pride, not warning signs. Bathing before touching their wives would have seemed laughable. Cleanliness was for women and servants. Masculinity, they thought, had no use for water. Some wives tried to insist on washing. They brought bowls of warm water to the bedside, but their husbands brushed them aside. Such gestures were considered silly or insulting, as though a man could be tainted by his own labour. Women were taught not to argue, not to spoil the mood of the marital duty. They endured instead, letting the ritual unfold while their bodies bore the consequences. Doctors saw the aftermath, fever, infection, and inflammation, but treated symptoms rather than the cause. They prescribed rest or tonics, rarely suspecting the obvious. Within the narrow confines of Victorian morality, the male body was considered pure by default. A man's work, his sweat, even his filth, were signs of vitality. The female body, by contrast, was seen as delicate and prone to corruption. Thus, when an infection appeared, it was always the woman's fault. The imbalance was moral as much as physical. She was expected to stay clean, though her husband never did. I cannot help but feel a grim irony in how men of that time worshipped the idea of purity while spreading disease with their own touch. Even the emerging field of medicine offered little help. Many doctors dismissed the notion that washing could prevent illness, calling it unnecessary or unmanly. Hospitals reeked of death because surgeons operated without gloves, their hands unwashed between patients. If professionals refused to cleanse, what chance did ordinary men have of understanding hygiene was an afterthought, and women's suffering remained invisible behind the curtain of ignorance? The intimacy between husband and wife was stripped of gentleness. It was not touch born of affection, but of habit. The hands that gripped tools and horses' reins were the same that explored the most sensitive parts of another body. The friction of dirt against skin caused tiny tears, each one an open door for infection. Pain became part of the routine. Some women lived with a constant ache, their nights marked by discomfort they could never name aloud. To speak of such things was indecent, to question a husband's behaviour unthinkable. Even among the upper class, where perfumed gloves and handkerchiefs were common, the illusion of cleanliness persisted. A gentleman might smell of cologne and carry a silver-topped cane, yet his nails hid the grime of tobacco and street dust. The outward elegance only deepened the hypocrisy. Appearances were sacred, truth irrelevant. A spotless collar mattered more than a clean conscience, and behind those polished appearances, infections festered unseen, rotting away the quiet dignity of married life. The damage extended beyond the physical. Each careless touch reinforced a hierarchy where women's bodies existed for use, not for care. The neglect was not cruelty by intention, but by indifference. Men had never been taught to think of cleanliness as respect. To them, intimacy was another chore completed before sleep, another proof of authority. The idea that tenderness could mean washing one's hands first would have seemed laughable. As time went on, medical understanding began to change. The notion that invisible agents caused disease slowly gained ground. But for countless women, this came too late. The infections they endured left lasting damage, infertility, chronic pain, and even death. The stains of ignorance did not wash away easily, either from skin or from history. What remained was a legacy of neglect disguised as normalcy. The act of touch without care left women suffering in silence long after the lights went out. The idea of hygiene had never reached the realm of affection, leaving tenderness replaced by habit. Yet the pain of neglect would soon deepen, not from filth alone, but from the absence of compassion itself. In the quiet of the Victorian bedroom, a woman's silence was more valued than her pleasure. From the moment she married, she was taught that a respectable wife did not move, did not speak, did not feel too much. The body was a duty, not a source of joy. To close her eyes and remain still was a sign of virtue. To express desire was shameful. In a world ruled by appearances, even passion had to wear a mask. It is strange to think that a civilization so proud of refinement saw stillness in bed as the height of female decency. The rules of intimacy were shaped by fear and hypocrisy. Victorian society demanded chastity from women and indulgence from men. A woman's virtue was measured not by her happiness but by her restraint. She was expected to lie quietly, to let the act happen to her rather than take part in it. A good wife endured without sound. The smallest sign of pleasure could be taken as corruption, as if her body's natural response was evidence of moral failure. Many learned to hide their breath, to bite their lips, to pretend they felt nothing at all. Men were raised to believe that desire belonged only to them. The female body existed for their use and for reproduction. They saw themselves as protectors, even while they ignored the harm they caused. Intimacy was a task to be completed, not a connection to be shared. Few paused to wonder what their wives felt, or whether they felt anything at all. If this were translated into today's world, it would be like expecting someone to smile while living without air, pretending comfort inside suffocation. The medical establishment reinforced this cruelty. Doctors declared that women were naturally passive, incapable of real sexual feeling. Any sign of arousal was pathologized as hysteria. They wrote that a woman's pleasure was irrelevant, sometimes even dangerous. To seek it was to risk madness. These ideas spread quickly through polite society, teaching women to distrust their own sensations. The body became an enemy that had to be controlled. Even the smallest expression of emotion was trained out of them, replaced by a practiced calm that hid exhaustion and fear. This emotional repression left scars that were never visible. Nights were filled with anxiety, not anticipation. Some women lay awake long after their husbands slept, their minds circling the dread of the next demand. The body tightened against touch, preparing for what could not be refused. The silence that followed each encounter was heavy, filled with unspoken shame. The language of affection became mechanical movements repeated without meaning. I find it haunting how easily cruelty can disguise itself as respect when silence is mistaken for virtue. In wealthier homes, the same rules applied behind layers of luxury. Perfumed sheets and soft lighting could not change the emptiness of the act. Women wore fine nightgowns and jewelled hairpins, yet the expectations were the same. They were to appear modest, obedient, and quiet. To take the initiative would ruin their reputation. Their husbands might speak tenderly in public, but in private, love was defined by control. The unspoken message was clear: a pure woman did not enjoy herself. Among the poor, silence was not only social but practical. Thin walls and crowded rooms meant every sound could be overheard. Women learned to suppress their voices out of necessity, pressing their faces into pillows to hide the noise of pain or humiliation. In such spaces, the line between decency and survival blurred completely. Pleasure was not even a thought. It was a luxury far beyond reach. The consequences of this conditioning lasted far beyond the act itself. Women grew fearful of their own bodies, ashamed of natural instincts they could not erase. Some avoided intimacy altogether, feigning illness or exhaustion. Others accepted their fate, treating each night as a duty. The connection between affection and touch broke entirely. The home that should have been a refuge became a place of quiet dread. Victorian men, meanwhile, mistook this stillness for satisfaction. They believed silence meant consent, that the absence of protest was proof of devotion. Their ignorance was protected by pride and social norms. To question their own behaviour would have meant admitting fault, something few were willing to do. Instead, they clung to the illusion of harmony while their wives withered in emotional isolation. Religion, too, played its part. Preachers praised modest wives who submitted without complaint, calling their obedience holy. Spiritual purity became entangled with physical denial. Women were told that their suffering was sacred, that to suppress their feelings was to elevate their souls. The result was a generation of women who believed that to feel was to sin, and to suffer quietly was divine. Over time, this silence seeped into everything. It defined how women walked, spoke, and even breathed. Their voices grew softer, their movements smaller. They smiled in public and wept in secret, trapped between expectation and reality. The culture that praised restraint also punished expression. To be human was dangerous, to be numb was safe. The cost of this repression was not only emotional but physical. Many women developed insomnia, trembling fits, and fainting spells, symptoms dismissed as hysteria but born from constant fear. The body kept the secrets the voice could not speak. Their hearts raced at every touch, not from excitement, but from panic, and still, society saw only their calm faces and tidy homes, proof of moral success built upon invisible suffering. In the end, silence became the greatest performance of all. It preserved reputations, upheld households, and destroyed the women who maintained them. Their stillness was not peace, it was surrender disguised as grace. The absence of sound became the sound of survival. The quiet obedience that once seemed virtuous revealed its cost in sleepless nights and broken spirits. The world outside saw serenity, but behind closed doors lived exhaustion and fear. And just as silence had smothered women's voices, another kind of silence was beginning to take hold, one enforced not by manners, but by medicine itself. The act often began before a woman's body was ready for it. There was no patience, no waiting for her to feel comfort or warmth. The moment the husband decided, the act was set in motion. His body moved by habit, not affection, guided by the belief that a wife's willingness was automatic. The lack of moisture turned every movement into friction. Pain followed where tenderness should have been, and what was meant to unite two people became a slow tearing of flesh. It is grimly ironic that in an age so obsessed with modesty, the body itself was forced to bleed to prove obedience. Foreplay was rarely understood or practiced. Desire in women was viewed as something shameful or non-existent. Men were taught that only they possessed true appetite. A woman's stillness was not seen as resistance, but as refinement. The less she responded, the more respectable she appeared. The result was a pattern of intimacy that ignored biology entirely. Dryness was taken as proof of virtue, not discomfort. When pain came, it was endured in silence, because to complain was to invite suspicion of impurity. The lack of preparation turned every touch into abrasion. Skin tore in small, invisible places, and the soreness lingered long after. Some women bled slightly after each encounter, staining the sheets they would later wash alone. Others developed infections that burned for days, leaving them feverish and unable to walk comfortably. Yet they rarely rested. Marital duty did not pause for recovery. If we compare this to today, it would be like being forced to run barefoot on broken glass and then told the wounds were proof of your devotion. The pain was never discussed. Men assumed it was normal, a minor inconvenience that women simply tolerated. The medical world echoed this belief. Doctors called it delicate discomfort, or blamed the female constitution for being overly sensitive. No one questioned the cause. The act was not about connection, but completion. Husbands performed it as an obligation, wives received it as fate. Love was replaced by rhythm, and intimacy became a task rather than a moment of understanding. The emotional distance matched the physical cruelty. Wives prepared for these encounters with dread. Some prayed beforehand, asking for strength or numbness. Others closed their eyes and waited for it to end. Tears often fell silently, absorbed by pillows that had already witnessed too much. The bed that should have been a place of warmth became an altar of endurance. I often think the real tragedy was not the pain itself, but the belief that such pain was acceptable, even expected. For many, recovery was impossible. The body healed slowly, only to be torn again the following night. Women learned to move carefully during the day, to sit in ways that eased the soreness between their legs. They applied cold cloths or herbs in secret, trying to soothe the damage. These small acts of care were done quietly, hidden from husbands who would never understand or care to ask. In their minds, what mattered was frequency, not comfort. A wife's suffering was invisible, her compliance taken as satisfaction. Some women lost the ability to feel anything at all. The nerves dulled, the body withdrew from sensation. Others began to associate touch with pain so deeply that they flinched at even casual contact. Over time, affection itself became unbearable. Marriage, in this sense, became a repetition of violation masked as duty. It eroded both body and spirit, leaving behind something hollow that still called itself love. The culture of repression turned every sign of female discomfort into moral judgment. If a woman bled or winced, it was said she was weak. If she expressed no pleasure, she was praised for modesty. The very symptoms of harm became badges of virtue. Men, unaware of their role in it, carried on proudly, convinced they were fulfilling both marital and moral responsibilities. The misunderstanding was complete, and no one dared to break it. Religion offered no relief. Clergymen spoke of marriage as sacred, of the wife's body as belonging to her husband. They quoted scripture to justify obedience, turning injury into holiness. To resist was to sin, and to suffer quietly was to serve. The teachings wrapped cruelty in sanctity, making it untouchable. Under such beliefs, compassion was not weakness, it was heresy. The walls of Victorian homes hid these small violence. They happened in silence, behind lace curtains and candlelight, to neighbours and friends. These couples looked respectable, their lives orderly and pure. No one imagined the truth that each embrace could draw blood, that each night left behind pain disguised as virtue. The irony was unbearable, a culture obsessed with propriety that allowed its women to bleed unseen. Over the years, these unspoken wounds shaped generations. Mothers passed their silence to daughters, teaching them endurance as though it were wisdom. They spoke of marriage as a responsibility, not joy. The idea that intimacy could involve comfort or consent was unthinkable. The cycle continued, built on ignorance and reinforced by shame. What happened in those beds was not passion, but repetition. Each encounter chipped away at the body and the spirit alike, until nothing was left but habit. To the outside world, they were proper couples. Inside, they were strangers trapped by ritual. Their lives moved forward in quiet agony, the pain buried under layers of respectability. The pattern of cold intimacy revealed the heart of Victorian morality, a world that valued control over compassion, appearance over truth. The act that should have joined two people instead divided them, one giving pain, the other giving silence. In that silence, something dark awaited, where medicine itself would soon turn the same cruelty into treatment. Doctors in the Victorian era often claimed to treat women's nervous disorders with their own hands. The complaints were vague but common: pain in the stomach, sleeplessness, sadness, or what they called hysteria. Women came to clinics desperate for relief, describing heaviness in the body, tension in the chest, and a feeling of restlessness they could not name. Physicians, most of them men, listened with polite detachment. Then they prescribed the same remedy to nearly all manual stimulation of the genitals until relief was achieved. It is astonishing how medicine, once called an act of control, a cure simply because it wore the mask of science. These procedures took place in ordinary offices lit by oil lamps, not secret chambers. The patient was asked to lie back, covered only by a cloth, while the doctor began what he believed to be therapy. The term hysteria covered almost any symptom that could not be explained: sadness, fatigue, irritability, even desire itself. Since doctors considered women incapable of sexual pleasure, they did not see their actions as indecent. The goal was to bring about what they called a hysterical paroxysm, a brief trembling that supposedly restored balance to the nervous system. What the patient experienced was never asked. The contradiction was enormous. Victorian morality condemned female sexuality in public, yet permitted its exploitation in private. So long as it was labelled treatment, doctors claimed authority, women surrendered modesty, and the body became a site of medical experiment rather than understanding. Many women reported feeling lighter afterward, unaware that their so-called illness was born not of disease but of repression. Their relief was physical, but the cause remained unspoken. If we compare this to today, it would be like a doctor prescribing intimacy to cure loneliness and calling it science. The practice grew rapidly. Clinics filled with women seeking help for ailments that no one else took seriously. For many, it was their first moment of release in years. The trembling that followed the doctor's touch was reinterpreted as proof of cure, not of arousal. Physicians congratulated themselves on their success, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that they were exploiting ignorance. The line between healing and violation blurred completely. What made this possible was the silence surrounding female desire. Society insisted that respectable women did not experience lust. Doctors echoed this belief, convinced that what they witnessed in their offices was purely a medical response. To them, it was no more scandalous than setting a bone or sewing a wound. They spoke of muscles, nerves, and fluids, not feelings. The clinical language hid the reality women were being touched without genuine consent, under the guise of care. Some women found the experience disturbing but felt powerless to object. A doctor's authority was absolute. Questioning his actions could mean ridicule or dismissal. Others returned willingly, ashamed of the need but unable to deny the temporary relief. It was a cycle sustained by ignorance, modesty, and desperation. The procedure became routine, a standard treatment listed in medical manuals across Europe and America. I find it unsettling that so much harm can be done by people who truly believe they are helping. Over time, doctors began to complain that the process was exhausting. The treatment required time, patience, and precision. Some sought mechanical assistance. Thus came the invention of the first electromechanical vibrator, marketed as a device to reduce the doctor's workload. Its purpose was the same: to bring about the therapeutic paroxysm more efficiently. The device hummed quietly in clinics, its presence considered respectable because it was a machine, not a man. The absurdity of the situation escaped nearly everyone. No one saw it as sexual, it was mechanical, and therefore moral. The deeper cruelty of this practice was its deception. Women seeking help were never told what was being done to them in emotional terms. Their pleasure, shame, or confusion was irrelevant. The medical establishment transformed human intimacy into a symptom to be managed. Behind each procedure lay the unspoken truth that female desire, when denied recognition, would always return disguised as illness. The treatment cured nothing. It only perpetuated misunderstanding. Religion and social codes contributed to the charade. Clergymen spoke against passion while physicians profited from it. The body became a battlefield between restraint and release, with women caught helpless in between. Their pain was never taken seriously unless it could be turned into profit or control. The more society suppressed their emotions, the more women sought medical permission to express them. And the doctors, proudly professional, became priests of a new kind of ritual. For upper-class women, these visits were discreet but frequent. A nervous condition became almost fashionable, proof of sensitivity and refinement. They left the clinic refreshed, reassured by the doctor's calm demeanour. Meanwhile, poorer women lacked even this pretense of care. Their suffering went untreated, dismissed as common fatigue. Only those with means could afford to have their repression packaged as therapy. As time passed, some voices began to question the ethics of the procedure. A few female doctors, rare at the time, criticized the practice as humiliation disguised as help. But their warnings were ignored. The men in charge refused to believe they could be doing harm. They saw themselves as guardians of health, never as participants in violation. The system continued until the 20th century, long after the world had begun to speak of freedom and progress. The so-called therapy reveals much about Victorian hypocrisy. A culture that preached purity invented a medical excuse to violate it. Women's bodies were controlled in every sense socially, sexually, scientifically. Their pleasure was treated as illness, their pain as evidence of weakness. What was sold as healing was, in truth, the quiet repetition of the same dominance that ruled their marriages and homes. Each visit to the clinic ended the same way: a sigh of relief, a word of reassurance, and the closing of a door. The doctor recorded success. The patient left subdued, and the cycle began again. To those outside, it was medicine. To those inside, it was something far more intimate and far more tragic. The illusion of care hid a profound misunderstanding of what it meant to be human. The so-called cure for hysteria was not a remedy at all, but a reflection of how deeply the era misunderstood women's bodies. What began as treatment became another form of exploitation cloaked in science. And soon, that same misunderstanding would reach beyond the clinic, taking root in the homes where medicine and morality shared the same bed. Animal fat was one of the most common substances in Victorian households. It was used for cooking, for polishing boots, for softening leather, and quietly, for the human body. When intimacy was uncomfortable, some women turned to what was available: mutton fat, horse fat, or even rendered snake oil were rubbed onto the skin as makeshift lubrication. It was a crude solution to a problem no one dared to name. It is darkly humorous that an era obsessed with propriety could tolerate smearing kitchen grease onto their own bodies in silence. The fat, when warmed by the body, melted into a slick layer that eased friction for a moment, but its texture was heavy and suffocating, clinging to the skin like wax. Afterward, It cooled into a residue that sealed pores and trapped sweat. The smell was distinct, sharp, and animal. Women washed as best they could with cold water and coarse soap, yet the odour lingered for days. Still, they repeated the ritual, believing it practical, harmless, and modest. Few realised that what they applied for comfort often led to infection, rash, or fever. There was no market for proper lubricants. The idea itself was unmentionable. To acknowledge discomfort in the marital bed would have been shameful. So, households used what they had. Mutton fat from the kitchen or the butcher's scrapings became the private medicine of modest wives. Some tried to improve it with herbs or perfume, thinking that the fragrance would hide the stench. It only made things worse. The oils mixed poorly, creating a sour, rancid smell that clung to fabric and skin alike. If we imagine this in today's world, it would be like using melted candle wax as lotion and calling it intimacy care. The mixture of heat, fat, and sweat created the perfect environment for bacteria. Small cuts became inflamed, and the thick coating blocked air from reaching the skin. Infections spread easily, often mistaken for mysterious feminine ailments. Doctors prescribed rest, tonics, or purgatives, never suspecting the true cause. Women were left to suffer through burning and swelling, too ashamed to describe what they had done. The practice was passed quietly between friends or servants, spoken of in whispers as something useful for difficult nights. Some went further, seeking stronger sensations. Old apothecaries sold stimulating ointments that claimed to restore passion. They contained mixtures of animal fat, alcohol, and scented oils. A few even used snake oil, believed to awaken the senses. The effect was immediate and painful, burning rather than arousing. Yet those who felt it thought the pain meant it was working. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how desperation turned ignorance into injury, and injury into routine. Behind this habit was a deep misunderstanding of the body. Victorian education did not teach women about their own anatomy. The female body was a mystery to its owner, something to be obeyed but never explored. When pain came, it was accepted as fate. When irritation followed, it was hidden. Cleanliness was measured by smell, not health, as long as the odour could be disguised with lavender or rose oil. The damage beneath did not matter. In wealthier homes, perfumed ointments were kept in small jars with silver lids. They looked refined, but their contents were no better than what poorer women used. The difference was only in presentation. A lady might keep such a jar beside her powders and combs, pretending it was merely a cosmetic cream. Her maid, who prepared the mixture, likely knew the truth but never spoke of it. The hypocrisy was complete, propriety above all, even at the cost of pain. Animal fat clung not only to skin but to memory. The sheets absorbed it, darkening over time, releasing faint odours when warmed again by the body. Some women scrubbed the stains with vinegar or lye, but the smell always returned. It became part of the atmosphere of the room, a constant reminder of habits that could not be named. The intimacy that should have felt human instead reeked of livestock and decay. No one questioned these customs because no one spoke of them. The male body was considered pure by virtue of authority. The female body was expected to endure quietly. If irritation or infection followed, it was a private matter. To ask for medical help would invite humiliation. Women treated themselves with the same substances that caused the problem, trapped in a cycle of harm mistaken for care. The silence was as thick as the grease itself. In time, reformers began to write about cleanliness and hygiene, but their advice rarely reached the bedroom. Manuals spoke of modesty, not health. They warned against indulgence, not disease. The act remained secret, shaped by discomfort and superstition. The fat, the pain, the smell, all were normalized, folded into the rhythm of married life. The use of animal fat as lubrication was more than a primitive habit. It was a reflection of everything the Victorian world refused to face: its ignorance of women's bodies, its fear of pleasure, and its worship of appearances. What should have been care became contamination, and what should have been shared became solitary suffering. The traces of these crude remedies lingered in every sense, on the body, in the air, in the quiet shame that followed. They were small acts of desperation, carried out in the name of modesty and love. Yet even as the body burned, society remained proud of its morality, blind to the harm that morality caused. The slick sheen of fat promised ease, but beneath it lay infection, isolation, and denial. The search for comfort would soon turn even darker, leading women to pour harsher substances into their own bodies in pursuit of a false purity. After intimacy, many Victorian women rushed to cleanse themselves, believing purity could be restored with the right mixture. They mixed vinegar, salt water, or even their own urine to wash away traces of sex. These homemade solutions were passed from one woman to another, whispered between friends, printed discreetly in pamphlets, and recommended as natural protection. The idea was simple but dangerous. They thought that harshness meant effectiveness, that pain meant cleanliness. It is grimly ironic that what was meant to wash away shame often ended up destroying the very body it tried to protect. The act of rinsing became a ritual, a basin, a cloth, and whatever liquid could be found were all it took. Vinegar burned the inner skin instantly, leaving behind a sting that lasted hours. Salt dried the tissues, causing cracks that bled slightly but went unnoticed in the dim light. Urine was believed to have purifying qualities, its warmth mistaken for healing. The sensations that followed, burning, itching, soreness, were endured silently. To speak of it would mean admitting to what had just taken place, and that was a greater shame. Medical understanding of the female body was shallow at best. The concept of hygiene was mixed with superstition. Women were told that cleanliness was not only physical but moral, that a good wife must erase any sign of passion from her body. Water alone was considered too gentle to do the job. It had to sting, to feel like punishment. In that pain, they believed virtue was restored. If we compare this to today, it would be like using bleach to wash your hands and calling it care. The result was predictable but cruel. The inner walls of the body, delicate and sensitive, could not withstand such abuse. Inflammation spread quickly, turning mild irritation into a deep infection. Some developed constant pain, others lost the ability to conceive. Doctors saw the symptoms but never traced them to the cause. They prescribed tonics or bed rest, unaware that their patients were quietly poisoning themselves in pursuit of purity. For many women, every act of intimacy was followed by pain, and every pain was blamed on weakness. The idea of self-purification was deeply tied to the moral codes of the time. The Victorian woman was taught to be clean in mind, body, and spirit. To her, impurity was not only physical contact but the very idea of desire. So she cleansed herself of both, scrubbing away guilt as if it were dirt. The harsher the mixture, the more virtuous she felt. It was an act of control in a world that offered her none. Even as her body ached and burned, she believed she was doing what was right. In wealthier homes, porcelain basins and scented cloths replaced wooden buckets, but the practice remained the same. Perfumed vinegar was sold under delicate names like ladies' water, advertised as refined and medical. The rich could afford elegance, yet they suffered the same consequences. Their chambers smelled faintly of flowers and acid, an invisible reminder of the cost of propriety. No one questioned it, for the line between pain and virtue had already blurred beyond recognition. Women shared recipes the way others shared remedies for headaches or fevers. Some claimed that adding rose water softened the sting. Others mixed in crushed herbs to balance the humours. Nothing worked. The burning persisted, the discomfort deepened, and infection spread silently. Still, they continued, convinced that discomfort was proof of moral success. Those who avoided the ritual were whispered about as careless or unclean. Shame was the most effective teacher of all. The tragedy of these practices was not only their physical harm, but their persistence. They lasted for decades, reinforced by ignorance and fear. Even when science began to question them, social norms refused to yield. Women had learned to equate purity with pain, obedience with health, and silence with dignity. Breaking that pattern required more than knowledge. It required unlearning an entire belief system. In the poorest districts, the ingredients were even harsher. Without access to vinegar or herbs, some used whatever liquid they could find, sometimes cold, stagnant water from public wells. The infections that followed spread through entire neighbourhoods, leaving women sick and infertile. They were scolded for neglecting hygiene, never realising they were victims of its misunderstanding. Doctors saw it as proof that the poor were careless, not that society had failed to educate them. The image of a woman bending over a basin, scrubbing away traces of her own body, captures everything cruel about Victorian morality. It was not cleanliness she sought, but absolution. In her mind, she was not tending to her body but to her soul. The sting was her penance, the pain her proof of virtue. And when the burning subsided into numbness, she felt clean again, unaware that the real damage was already done. The ritual of self-cleansing after intimacy was not about health, but control. It revealed how deeply the era had turned womanhood into a battleground of purity and shame. Each drop of vinegar, each grain of salt, each painful rinse was a confession performed in silence. The body became both sinner and sacrifice. The illusion of cleanliness hid the truth that the more they cleansed, the more they suffered. Each rinse left them weaker. Each night ended with the same ache. And still they returned to the basin as if salvation waited inside. The burning they mistook for virtue became the quiet echo of their submission. Yet something darker still waited beyond the pain, where the idea of purity would demand not just cleansing, but silence itself. In many Victorian slums, there were no beds to share, only the floor. The poor lived packed into small rooms where straw, dirt, and sweat mixed into a single surface. At night, when the day's exhaustion left no strength for thought, intimacy happened wherever there was space, on damp boards, on packed soil, sometimes beside the same fire used for cooking. It was not passion that brought people together there, but the simple instinct to feel alive for a moment in the middle of decay. It is bitterly ironic that love, in its most human form, was practiced in the same filth that bred disease. The floors were rarely clean. Rats scurried along the corners, leaving droppings in the straw. Cockroaches hid in cracks, crawling out when the lamps were blown out. Moisture from the walls soaked into the boards, feeding mould that never dried. The stench was constant, a blend of rot, urine, and smoke. When bodies pressed against that ground, their skin touched not warmth, but the residue of poverty itself. And yet, for many, it was the only place available. To deny the act was to deny connection. To perform it was to risk infection. The dirt was more than visible grime. It carried every kind of a life the city created and forgot. Fleas bit at the ankles, worms hid in the cracks, and the dust that floated in the air was laced with soot and waste. When skin met that surface, the smallest cuts became gateways for disease. Afterward, the itching began. Rashes spread quickly, especially on the thighs and genitals. The discomfort became part of daily existence, no longer shocking, simply another symptom of survival. If we imagine this in the modern world, it would be like sleeping on a subway floor and calling it home. The poor did not choose this out of neglect. It was a necessity. Beds cost money, and space was a luxury. Entire families shared single rooms, sometimes even single mattresses. Privacy was an idea reserved for the rich. Curtains or hung sheets served as walls, thin barriers that muffled nothing. In that environment, shame had no meaning. Intimacy was stripped of mystery and reduced to routine. It happened quietly, efficiently, often in darkness, before fatigue replaced desire. What little comfort they found came from closeness rather than pleasure. The warmth of another body meant survival through the night's cold. The rats that scuttled nearby were tolerated because they, too, were part of the room's life. People learned to move carefully, not to wake children sleeping beside them or crush the insects crawling underfoot. The line between the human and the animal blurred, erased by the same hunger and fatigue. The body no longer belonged to emotion, but to endurance. Doctors and reformers later wrote about the dangers of such living conditions, but their words reached no one who needed them. The poor were blamed for their filth, as though they enjoyed disease. Yet the blame never reached those who built cities without sanitation or charged rent for rotting floors. Health pamphlets spoke of moral cleanliness, not physical hygiene. They warned against lust, not lice. It was easier to condemn behaviour than to fix poverty. Women suffered the most. Their skin, softer and more exposed, absorbed the grime more easily. Infections of the lower body became common, spreading silently through households. Some miscarried from untreated disease. Others became infertile. The men rarely noticed. Their own pain was brief. For women, it lingered. The burns, the swelling, the discharge, all seen as the natural burden of womanhood. To complain was to appear weak or ungrateful. To stay silent was survival. I find it haunting that in those rooms, tenderness and contamination were the same thing. When morning came, life resumed as if nothing had happened. The same floor that served as a bed became the table, the workspace, the nursery. A thin layer of dust or ash might be swept away, but the deeper filth remained. Children crawled where their parents had lain the night before. The boundary between private and public, between clean and unclean, had long dissolved. Religious leaders preached about virtue and the cleanliness of the soul, but their sermons never reached the slums. What good was purity to those who had no water, no light, no space to breathe? The poor knew that moral advice would not keep them warm. The body's needs outweighed its dignity, and so, night after night, the cycle continued. The same dirt, the same cold, the same attempt to find a moment of comfort before dawn. To outsiders, these acts looked like vice. To those inside, they were life. A momentary warmth in an endless winter of hunger. The city itself fed on their suffering, its factories built by the same hands that slept in its gutters. The filth of their homes mirrored the moral decay of the empire that ignored them. Cleanliness was never just about soap, it was about power, and those without it were left to rot quietly, their bodies carrying the proof of inequality. The stories of intimacy on filthy floors are not tales of shame, but of endurance. They reveal how poverty reshaped love, stripping it down to survival. There was no romance, no comfort, only the quiet understanding that even in dirt, people sought each other. And from that seeking came both life and sickness. Each creak of the floor, each breath mixed with dust, carried the echo of a world that accepted misery as normal. The ground beneath them was both cradle and coffin, holding the secrets of a society that measured virtue by wealth. The acts that took place there were not immoral, only inevitable. Yet beneath the grime, something darker still waited, where the cost of survival would demand silence, not only from the poor, but from every woman in the city. In the rigid morality of the Victorian age, a woman's pleasure was not a sign of health, but of madness. Doctors and husbands alike believed that the female body existed to serve, not to feel. When a woman trembled, breathed heavily, or cried out in the throes of release, the response was not compassion, but fear. Her behaviour was labelled as hysteria or nymphomania. words that cloaked ignorance in authority. It is astonishing that something as natural as pleasure could be redefined as a symptom of disease simply because it belonged to women. The idea spread quickly through polite society. Respectable wives who showed passion were whispered about as unstable. Those whose bodies responded visibly during intimacy were accused of losing control. Self-restraint was the ultimate virtue, silence, the proof of sanity. Any reaction beyond stillness became proof of disorder. The doctors agreed. They claimed that women's nerves were fragile, that excessive excitement could cause uterine dysfunction or insanity. They wrote essays, gave lectures, and convinced families that female passion was something to be treated. The treatment often began at home. A husband, embarrassed by his wife's episodes, might confide in a doctor. Soon after, the woman would find herself examined, questioned, and sometimes confined. The doctors called it protection. They said they were preserving the woman's moral health. What they really did was erase her autonomy, turning emotion into illness. If we compare this to today, it would be like sending someone to a hospital for laughing too loudly in public. The so-called patients were often women who had simply felt desire. A single cry of pleasure, overheard or admitted, could be enough to condemn them. Families acted swiftly to avoid scandal. In upper-class homes, the process was clean and discreet, a carriage ride to a rest home, polite paperwork, and a signature. In poorer families, it was rougher. Women were dragged to asylums and left behind gates that clanged shut. The men who brought them there were praised for their responsibility. Inside the institutions, the reality was cruel. The women were stripped of privacy and given strict routines. Cold baths, sedatives, and isolation replaced human warmth. Doctors claim these treatments calmed the nerves. In truth, they silenced the victims. The medical charts recorded progress in measured tones, patient quieter today, patient compliant. But behind those notes lay exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Some never left. Their only crime had been to express the natural rhythm of their bodies. The hypocrisy was staggering. The same society that allowed men to frequent brothels without consequence punished women for feeling desire in their own homes. The same doctors who labelled wives as hysterical treated prostitutes with mock compassion, claiming they were necessary to protect men's virtue. Pleasure was permitted, but only if it was paid for. Love, when felt by a woman, became dangerous because it could not be controlled. The double standard was so deeply rooted that even women began to believe it. I find it heartbreaking that an entire generation was taught to fear the very part of themselves that made them human. The science that justified these beliefs was little more than superstition wrapped in Latin. Physicians wrote about uterine frenzy, a fictional condition that supposedly drove women to madness. They claim that excessive blood flow to the reproductive organs caused irrational behavior. The cure, predictably, was submission, rest, obedience, and medical intervention. Some doctors prescribed sexual restraint. Others performed surgical procedures to remove what they called the source of the disorder. It was mutilation disguised as medicine. For those confined, time moved slowly. They were isolated from family, forced to spend hours in silence or prayer. The walls were cold, the air damp, and the sounds of other patients echoed through the corridors like ghosts. A few women resisted, shouting their innocence until their voices failed. Others surrendered, numbed by medication and hopelessness. Outside, their husbands moved on, their reputations intact. Society called them widowers of the living. The legacy of these beliefs stretched far beyond the asylums. Even women who never saw the inside of one learned to suppress their responses. They lay still, bit their tongues, and trained their bodies to feel nothing. Passion became a secret shame. The language of medicine had turned their humanity into a threat, and fear replaced desire. Those who dared to defy it risked their freedom, their marriages, and their sanity. In drawing rooms and lecture halls, men debated the mysteries of the female mind. They spoke of control and morality, never realizing how much cruelty hid in their civility. Each diagnosis of hysteria, each whispered accusation of madness, reinforced the same lie that women could not be trusted with their own pleasure. What began as prejudice became doctrine, and what was doctrine became law. By the end of the century, a few voices began to challenge the madness of it all. Female doctors, reformers, and writers started to expose the truth, but their words were slow to take root. Respectable society still clung to its fear of passion, unwilling to see the harm it caused. Change came too late for those already lost behind the walls of asylums, their stories erased by the dust of official records. The Victorian fear of female pleasure revealed more than ignorance. It exposed the fragility of power itself. The men who ruled morality could not bear the thought that women might experience something they could neither grant nor control. So they pathologized it, imprisoned it, and called it sanity. In doing so, they buried not only women's desire but also their own humanity. The sound of a woman's gasp should have been a sign of life, not madness. Yet for the Victorians, it became the trigger of fear, the proof of disease. Pleasure was outlawed, medicine became the judge, and love itself turned into evidence. The silence that followed was heavier than any restraint, for it hid a truth no one dared to name, a truth that would soon find expression in something even more disturbing, where violation would no longer be private but disguised as care. After childbirth or miscarriage, the body was weak, open, and bleeding. Yet in many Victorian homes, rest was a luxury women were rarely allowed. Within days, some were forced to resume their marital duties, their wounds still fresh and their strength not yet returned. Husbands called it intimacy, but it was an act stripped of compassion. The blood had not stopped, the fever had not faded, yet obedience was expected. It is unbearable to think that the same moment which proved a woman's endurance as a mother became the beginning of her suffering as a wife. The physical reality of these encounters was brutal. The womb, still raw and healing, was invaded again before it had closed. The thin discharge that followed birth or miscarriage mixed with semen, creating a warm, infected pool inside the body. The smell that filled the sheets afterward was metallic and sour, a sign of decay mistaken for normality. Women often developed chills, cramps, and a deep ache in the abdomen, but no one thought to stop. They were told their weakness was emotional, that recovery would come through submission rather than rest. In wealthy homes, the setting was softer but no cleaner. White linens covered the beds, perfumed air filled the rooms, yet beneath the layers of lace and civility, the same ignorance ruled. Doctors advised against overindulgence, but they did not condemn the act itself. To question a husband's right was to risk scandal. The woman's pain became a private matter, something to be endured silently behind drawn curtains. Servants washed the bloodied sheets in the morning and said nothing. For poorer women, there was not even the pretence of care. They gave birth on the same straw they would later share with their husbands. When bleeding continued, they worked anyway, cooking, washing, feeding children. Nights offered no reprieve. If a man returned from the factory drunk or angry, he took what he wanted. The women's bodies were too exhausted to resist, and their cries too common to be heard. By morning, the blood on their thighs had darkened, and they rose to begin the same routine again. If we compare this to the modern world, it would be like being forced to run a marathon while your wounds were still open. The medical understanding of postpartum recovery was dangerously naive. Doctors treated childbirth as a mechanical event rather than a trauma. Once the baby was delivered, the mother was expected to resume her role as wife immediately. Rest was discouraged, often seen as laziness. Even infections were misunderstood. When fever and delirium followed childbirth, physicians called it childbed fever, as if it were a natural occurrence rather than the result of filth and forced contact. Countless women died, their deaths recorded as unfortunate but ordinary. Religious teaching made it worse. Clergymen preached that a wife must not deny her husband, even in weakness. The body belonged not to her but to the marriage. To refuse intimacy was to sin. In that belief, women bled through their sheets, their prayers unheard. The sanctity of marriage became an excuse for cruelty, and pain became the price of virtue. The blood that should have symbolized new life turned instead into a slow death. In those dim bedrooms, where gaslight flickered against damp walls, no one spoke of infection or recovery. The only measure of a woman's worth was endurance. The fevered flush on her face was taken as beauty, not danger. When her breathing grew shallow and her skin turned pale, it was called exhaustion, not the beginning of sepsis. By the time she could no longer rise from bed, it was often too late. The doctor would come, take her pulse, and write a certificate that blamed fate. Some husbands mourned honestly, unaware of their role in the death that followed. Others remarried quickly, repeating the same pattern with another woman. The system of silence continued, fed by ignorance and duty. The midwives who saw the truth were powerless to speak. Their warnings were dismissed as superstition. The blood of women was an acceptable cost for maintaining appearances. Even when reformers began to speak of hygiene and recovery, the message rarely reached inside the home. Public health addressed water and air, not the private violence of expectation. There were no laws protecting women from their own marriages. Doctors improved surgical tools, but not their empathy. They studied anatomy, but not suffering. The cycle of endurance and silence continued, wrapped in the illusion of moral order. In the aftermath, when a mother died, her children were told she was fragile, not wronged. Her death was used as a lesson for others, to pray harder, to obey better, to find peace in submission. The truth was buried with her, along with the sheets that no one dared to wash twice. The stain remained invisible, but its presence filled the air like a ghost. I often think the most terrifying part was not the pain itself, but how completely it was accepted as ordinary. The practice of forcing women to resume intimacy while still bleeding revealed the darkest part of Victorian life. It showed how love could be used as justification, how faith could mask cruelty, and how silence could kill. Every act done in the name of duty carried the weight of another wound. Every night of obedience pushed another life toward fever and decay. The image of a woman lying pale against blood-stained sheets is more than a tragedy. It is a truth the era refused to confront. Her suffering was sanctified, her death recorded as natural, her voice unheard. Yet beneath all that silence, another idea was beginning to grow, one that would challenge the very foundation of what a husband's right truly meant. Contraception in the Victorian era was considered both shameful and unnecessary. The few who dared to use it were whispered about as immoral or unmanly. Condoms did exist, thin sheaths made from sheep intestine, but they were expensive and fragile. Most men refused them altogether, claiming that real affection required no barrier. They spoke of trust and love, but what they truly meant was control. It is bleakly amusing that an era obsessed with decency saw nothing indecent in risking a woman's life for the sake of a man's comfort. For many couples, protection was simply not an option. The Church condemned any interference with conception as sin. Doctors dismissed it as unnatural, and society treated it as an act of rebellion. Women had little choice. If they refused, they risked violence or abandonment. If they accepted, they risked pregnancy, disease, and shame. A single act could change the course of a life, but the decision was never theirs to make. The word consent did not yet exist in the vocabulary of marriage. The condoms that did circulate were sold quietly in apothecaries or by travelling salesmen. They were washed, reused, and often torn during use. Some were so crude that they caused more harm than protection. The texture of dried animal gut was rough and brittle, and the stitching along the edges could cut skin. Even so, these were considered luxuries. For the poor, there was nothing but superstition and hope. They relied on prayers, timing, or withdrawal, all as unreliable as the men who promised restraint. The consequences were devastating. Countless women became pregnant year after year, their bodies breaking under the strain of endless childbirth. Others contracted venereal diseases brought home from brothels or mistresses. Their suffering was blamed on fate, not on their husbands. Doctors called it women's weakness, as if their exhaustion were a natural condition. In truth, it was the predictable outcome of neglect. If we compare this to today, it would be like driving without brakes and insisting that faith alone will stop the crash. Behind every polite facade, there were quiet tragedies, women who miscarried in secret, fearing judgment, wives who hid their sores and fevers beneath layers of clothing, midwives who helped desperate girls end unwanted pregnancies in the dark of night, knowing they could be jailed for it. The silence surrounding protection made it more dangerous than any sin could have been. Men continued without consequence, while women bore the physical and emotional weight of every choice they were denied. The discussion of contraception, when it did happen, was cloaked in absurd language. Doctors spoke of moral restraint instead of methods, and reformers wrote about family limitation as if it were a delicate art. The actual mechanics of prevention were considered too indecent to print. Books that dared to describe them were banned or burned. In drawing rooms, people pretended ignorance. In back alleys, women whispered advice that mixed rumour with desperation. The hypocrisy was unending. The same men who condemned contraception in public often used it in private with mistresses. Respectability required appearances, not honesty. The church preached virtue while turning a blind eye to suffering. Moral purity, it seemed, applied only to those who could afford it. The rest were left to bleed, bury, and begin again. A wife's exhaustion was mistaken for devotion, her silence for consent, her death for God's will. Even in medical circles, the idea of protecting women's health was secondary to maintaining male satisfaction. The discussion centered on control, not care. Some doctors claimed that the act itself was cleansing, that diseases could not spread between married couples, a convenient lie that excused ignorance. Others dismissed women's complaints as exaggerations or symptoms of hysteria. Pain, infection, and fear were treated as proof of weakness, not of the need for change. By the late 19th century, a few voices began to challenge this silence. Early feminists and social reformers spoke of contraception as liberation. They argued that love without choice was not love at all. Their words were scandalous, even criminal, yet they planted the first seeds of resistance. Pamphlets were printed in secret, teaching women how to protect themselves. Many were arrested for distributing them. The law defended morality. Morality defended misery. In most homes, nothing changed. Husbands still refused, wives still obeyed, and children still filled the cradles faster than they could be fed. The body of a woman remained public property, shaped by law, religion, and expectation. To ask for protection was to question the order of the world. And so, generation after generation, women paid the price in blood and silence. I find it chilling that love could become a weapon simply because protection was considered shameful. The refusal to use protection revealed not ignorance alone, but arrogance. It showed how comfort was valued above compassion, pride above safety. Each time a man said, "Trust me," he placed his pleasure above another person's life. Each time a woman stayed quiet, the cycle repeated, and within that silence, disease, fear, and unwanted births grew unchecked. Every drop of blood shed, every fever endured, every life lost was a quiet protest the world refused to hear. The idea of protection was not rejected for moral reasons, but because it threatened control. And in that control lay the foundation of every cruelty yet to come, where intimacy would no longer merely harm, it would consume. Oral sex in the Victorian era was a contradiction that few dared to name. It was condemned publicly as perverse, yet practiced secretly in bedrooms, brothels, and even within respectable marriages. The act itself was whispered about in disgust, called immoral and animalistic, but the curiosity remained. What made it dangerous was not only the secrecy but the complete absence of hygiene. No one brushed their teeth or rinsed their mouths beforehand. It was a meeting of flesh and decay, of intimacy performed with the same mouth that carried disease. It is both tragic and absurd that in an age obsessed with purity, people put faith in shame rather than in soap. The mouth of a Victorian man was far from clean. Daily hygiene was minimal, and toothbrushes, when they existed, were used rarely. Teeth rotted early, gums bled, and the breath carried the sour scent of tobacco, alcohol, and decay. When such mouths touched the body of another, the exchange was far from affectionate. It was a passage for bacteria, for infection, for unseen rot. The women, uneducated about their own anatomy, endured it silently. They believed that the pain, the burning, or the swelling that followed was simply another price of being a wife. Doctors at the time never spoke of oral hygiene in connection with intimacy. To them, the act was too indecent to study. Diseases of the mouth were treated as separate from those of the genitals, as though the human body were divided into moral and immoral parts. Yet infections spread easily. Mouth ulcers, gum abscesses, or sores could transfer directly, creating lesions that festered for weeks. In an age before antibiotics, even a small wound could turn fatal. If we compare this to today, it would be like licking a kitchen knife and calling it affection. The women who suffered were rarely believed. When they complained of irritation or sores, doctors called it hysteria or cleanliness anxiety. A wife's discomfort was never seen as her husband's fault. The blame always returned to her supposed fragility or lack of virtue. The silence became a pattern. The men continued unbothered, convinced of their dominance, while women carried infections that would later rob them of health, fertility, and peace. Among the poor, the situation was even worse. The lack of access to clean water, soap, or medical care meant that oral infections were common. Tooth decay and abscesses caused constant pain. Alcohol was used as the only disinfectant, and the same mouth that drank cheap gin or chewed tobacco became the instrument of intimacy. The result was inevitable sores, swelling, and fever. For many women, these illnesses never healed completely. They lived with chronic pain that no one acknowledged, because speaking of such things was forbidden. The hypocrisy of Victorian society was everywhere. Men visited brothels freely, engaging in acts they would never admit to at home. They returned to their wives carrying infections that spread without a trace of guilt. Doctors knew but said nothing, for confronting the upper classes meant risking their own reputation. Respectability depended on ignorance. It was easier to let women die of infection than to challenge the illusion of virtue. In upper-class homes, the behaviour was more discreet but no less unhygienic. Perfume and powder masked the scent of decay. Curtains, candles, and silence hid what took place. The act itself was never discussed, not even between partners. It existed as an unspoken compromise, a moment of submission mistaken for intimacy. The mouth that spoke prayers at dawn was the same mouth that carried disease at night. The contradiction was unbearable, yet it was considered proper as long as no one mentioned it aloud. I cannot help but feel a chill thinking of how many deaths came not from sin, but from silence. For some men, oral sex was not about pleasure but domination. The act symbolized control, reducing the woman to something beneath them. In such encounters, there was no tenderness, only proof of power. The lack of hygiene reflected not ignorance alone, but disregard. The women's health, dignity, and safety mattered less than the man's desire to feel superior. The idea of mutual respect did not exist. Pleasure was a privilege reserved for one side. Religious teaching reinforced the shame. Clergymen preached that such acts were sinful and unnatural, driving believers to hide them rather than avoid them. The secrecy only made the danger worse. In the absence of knowledge, myths replaced facts. Some claimed that semen had healing properties, and others believed that the mouth could purify the act by transforming it into something spiritual. Every lie born from repression became a reason for suffering. The fear of speaking about sex made education impossible. No guide, no pamphlet, no medical text explained the basic risks of hygiene. Parents never taught, doctors never warned, and schools never mentioned the human body beyond sin. When illness struck, women were blamed for impurity. Husbands demanded obedience even as their wives wasted away from infections. The cruelty was not intentional, it was habitual. The neglect became tradition. In brothels, the reality was no different. Prostitutes were forced to perform oral sex for survival, often multiple times a night, without access to clean water or care. Their mouths carried open sores, their throats burned with infection, and yet they were expected to smile. When the disease spread among them, society called it divine punishment. The men who infected them returned home untouched by guilt. The act that should have been about connection became an instrument of harm. It showed how far the Victorians went to deny the body's truth while indulging its weakness. They confused secrecy with morality and silence with purity. The result was a world where filth was hidden under lace, and suffering was mistaken for virtue. The mingling of mouths and sickness revealed not only a lack of cleanliness, but a deeper rot within the culture itself. Behind every act of passion lay decay. Behind every silence lay complicity. The disease of the era was not only bacterial, it was moral. What passed between lips and skin in those dark rooms was more than desire. It was the exchange of ignorance disguised as devotion. And soon, that same blindness would spread even further, turning the objects of daily life into tools of harm and humiliation. When desire was forbidden and loneliness too shameful to admit, women in the Victorian era turned to the only objects available to them. The kitchen, a place of duty and silence, became the setting for secret desperation. Spoons, broom handles, bottles, and rolling pins, tools meant for work, were quietly transformed into instruments of relief. There was no guidance, no understanding of anatomy, only the need to quiet a longing that society refused to acknowledge. It is grimly absurd that in an age that worshipped modesty, women had to seek comfort from the same utensils they used to scrub and serve. The use of these objects was not born from pleasure, but from repression. A woman's body was expected to be passive, obedient, and untouched unless her husband willed otherwise. Yet the body itself did not obey rules. Curiosity and frustration grew in the silence of closed bedrooms. Many women discovered sensation by accident while cleaning or bathing. Others learned through whispered confessions from maids or friends. But what they shared was ignorance. Without knowledge of hygiene or safety, they turned to whatever their hands could reach. The objects varied, but the outcome was often the same. Hard surfaces tore fragile tissue, wooden handles splintered, glass bottles cracked, and metal edges bruised. Without proper cleaning, infection followed quickly. The warmth and moisture of the body mixed with dirt, leading to fevers and abscesses that few understood. Some bled for days, too ashamed to seek help. When they finally did, doctors scolded rather than treated them. Their injuries were labelled moral failings rather than medical emergencies. If we compare this to today, it would be like being punished for seeking pain relief after being denied medicine. For many women, these acts were not about indulgence but survival. They lived in marriages devoid of affection, where sex was duty and touch was mechanical. The absence of tenderness left behind a hollow ache that could not be spoken of. A broom handle or a bottle became a substitute for acknowledgement, a poor imitation of care. It was not desire that drove them, but the human need to feel alive in a world that treated them as property. The risks were immense. A single slip could tear the cervix or puncture the uterus. Internal bleeding was common, infection even more so. Some died slowly from sepsis, their bodies feverish, their breath foul with decay. Families hid the truth. calling it illness or divine punishment. The Church preached that those who suffered such fates had sinned. No one dared to say that the real sin lay in a society that denied women the right to understand their own bodies. In wealthier homes, the implements were smaller, more refined: silver utensils, perfume bottles, and ivory brushes. The appearance of luxury did not change the danger. Glass shattered easily, and metal grew sharp with age. Servants sometimes discovered the evidence: bloodstains on towels, broken pieces hidden at the back of drawers, but they knew better than to speak. Silence was part of their survival, too. Everything was kept hidden, the pain buried under the weight of respectability. For working-class women, the shame was even heavier. They could not afford privacy, let alone secrecy. Their injuries were treated with cold water and rags, if treated at all. When infections spread, they simply endured. No doctor wanted to examine such wounds. No priest wanted to hear their confession. To speak of it was to risk ruin. So they carried on, their pain folded into their daily chores, their suffering disguised as fatigue. The paradox was complete. The very same tools used to feed families, clean homes, and polish the appearance of virtue became weapons against the women who wielded them. The broom that swept the floor might later be the instrument of agony. The bottle that held milk in the morning might cause bleeding at night. The kitchen, symbol of domestic order, turned into a hidden battlefield of shame and need. I find it unbearably tragic that the same hands that cooked and cared were forced to harm themselves for lack of tenderness. The men remained unaware or uninterested. Their wives' exhaustion was interpreted as piety, their distance as modesty. They never suspected what took place in the shadows of their own homes. If they did, they dismissed it as madness or immorality. The word pleasure belonged to men alone. For women, there was only silence. The absence of education turned intimacy into danger. A woman who knew nothing of her own anatomy could not know how to protect herself. Society had made sure of that. Books about the female body were censored, and questions were discouraged. The body became a mystery guarded by fear. When instinct finally broke through that fear, it found no safe outlet, only objects that cut, burned, or shattered. The doctors who encountered these injuries wrote about them in medical journals, but never with compassion. They described torn flesh, ruptured wombs, and foreign objects lodged deep inside, always with detached curiosity. Their tone was clinical, their judgment moral. To them, the women were curiosities, not victims. The reports were meant to warn, but they served instead to reinforce shame. These hidden tragedies reveal more than desperation. They expose the cruelty of repression. The women were not reckless. They were denied knowledge, denied affection, denied the right to seek comfort without fear. Their pain was not private sin but public failure, the consequence of a world that valued modesty more than mercy. The broken glass and bruised skin were only fragments of a larger truth. Behind every wound was a story of loneliness, silence, and defiance. In the absence of love, they turned to the objects of labour to reclaim even a trace of feeling. And soon, this desperate search for relief would take on an even darker form, one not performed in solitude, but imposed under the name of medicine. After the act was done, the room often fell into silence. The husband turned away, already half asleep, his breathing slow and heavy. The wife remained still beside him, her body damp with sweat, semen, and the faint scent of iron. There was no towel, no gesture of care, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. The bed became a cooling pool of fluids and fatigue. The warmth that had been shared moments before turned quickly into cold stickiness against the skin. It is both grotesque and revealing that in a culture built on manners, the bedroom was where civility always ended first. For the woman, there was no comfort afterward. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the mixture of fluids drying against her thighs and stomach. The air grew heavy with odour. Sometimes she shifted slightly, trying to find a dry patch of sheet, but even that small motion risked waking him. Her body ached, her mind drifted. The silence pressed harder than the weight of his body ever had. In those long minutes after, she was less a wife than a surface to be left behind. Hygiene was rarely considered, towels were seldom used, and the idea of washing after sex was foreign. To clean oneself immediately afterward was thought improper, even shameful, as though it admitted awareness of the body. So the fluids remained, seeping into skin and cloth. The mixture of sweat, semen, and vaginal discharge created a sticky residue that clung for hours. By morning, it had dried into a thin crust, marking both the bed and the body. Over time, the smell became a part of the room, impossible to scrub away completely. If we compare this to today, it would be like sleeping each night in the same unwashed sheets and calling it love. The neglect had consequences far beyond discomfort. Skin infections were common, particularly around the back, hips, and thighs, where contact was closest. The friction of dirty linen rubbed against pores, creating red sores that never fully healed. Some women developed chronic rashes, others suffered low fevers that came and went without explanation. Doctors called it female inflammation and blamed their nature, not their environment. The truth lay quietly in every unwashed bed, in every night of indifference. The lack of tenderness was as damaging as the lack of cleanliness. For many women, the moment after sex became the loneliest part of the night. The physical closeness faded instantly, replaced by the sound of a man snoring. There was no conversation, no shared warmth, no sign that what had happened meant anything more than duty fulfilled. The act that was supposed to join two lives instead underlined their distance. The bed, meant for intimacy, became a stage for solitude. In wealthier homes, the scene was wrapped in finer fabric but no more affection. The sheets were silk, the rooms perfumed, yet the ritual remained the same. The man finished, turned his back, and drifted into sleep while the woman stared at the embroidered canopy above. Servants would change the linens only after several nights, sometimes a week. Until then, the residue of each encounter accumulated like an invisible record of neglect. The marks on the sheets were treated as private, but they were evidence of something far deeper, a culture that mistook silence for virtue. Among the poor, the filth was unavoidable. Straw bedding soaked through, leaving damp patches that smelled of rot. There was no fresh linen to replace it, no clean cloth to dry with. Women simply wiped themselves with whatever was near, a piece of clothing, a corner of the blanket, sometimes nothing at all. They slept in their own residue, shivering as the dampness cooled. The next morning, they rose to scrub floors, cook meals, and begin again, their discomfort ignored as part of life. The medical world never addressed this neglect. Men's health was studied, their exhaustion treated, their appetites analysed. Women's hygiene, however, remained a topic of silence. The idea that they might need care after intimacy was considered indecent. Even mentioning it could ruin a woman's reputation. So they kept quiet, bathing secretly when they could, or wiping themselves with bits of cloth that were then hidden at the bottom of the wash baskets. It was care disguised as shame. I find it painfully telling that tenderness was seen as weakness, while disregard was mistaken for strength. The emotional coldness was just as infectious as the physical filth. A wife learned not to expect affection afterward, just as she learned not to expect comfort during. The small acts of love-holding, speaking softly, sharing warmth were replaced by habit. When the bed creaked again the next night, it was not out of desire but routine. She did not protest. To do so would invite ridicule or anger. It was better to endure in silence, to let the sheets tell her story. Even religion offered no solace. Sermons preached about the sanctity of marriage but never about the care it required. A woman's suffering was seen as part of divine order. The stains on the sheets were invisible in the eyes of the church. Only her obedience mattered. The bed that should have been a symbol of union became an altar of quiet sacrifice, where cleanliness, love, and respect were offered up together and forgotten. Over the years, this neglect left not just scars on the skin but in the heart. Women grew accustomed to detachment, mistaking numbness for peace. They learned to lie still, to clean silently, to pretend that indifference was normal. The body hardened, but the spirit withered. What began as a nightly habit turned into a life of quiet resignation. The stains faded, but the memory of cold sheets did not. Every night ended the same way, a man asleep, a woman awake, the air thick with the scent of sweat and sleep. The intimacy that was supposed to connect two souls instead became a ritual of abandonment. The room grew colder with each passing hour, and by morning, only the smell remained. The pattern would continue, unchanged, until even the smallest act of care would seem like a miracle. The silence after each embrace was the truest reflection of Victorian love. Duty without empathy, possession without presence. It was not hatred that filled those rooms, but emptiness. And within that emptiness, something began to shift, where indifference would soon give way to punishment disguised as medicine. The night did not end with the act itself. Once the man had turned away, the woman often reached for her nightgown, damp and clinging, and slipped it back over her sticky skin. The fabric, once soft, was now heavy with sweat, discharge, and semen. It cooled against her body, leaving a faint chill that made her shiver. But she did not change. The idea of replacing her clothing after intimacy seemed excessive, even improper. In many homes, there was only one nightdress for the week, sometimes for the season. It is almost ironic that people so obsessed with moral purity could not imagine the purity of simply being clean. As she moved beneath the sheets, the cloth rubbed against her thighs and stomach, spreading the moisture over her skin. Within hours, it began to dry, leaving behind a film that clung like dust. The smell was faint at first, a mixture of body fluids and old linen, but by morning it would grow stronger, musky and sour. Still, no one spoke of it. She would rise with the sun, pull her gown tighter, and go about her chores as if nothing had happened. The garment that had soaked in the intimacy of the night became her uniform for the day. In the cold light of dawn, the stains stood out more clearly. Pale streaks and dark spots marked the fabric, reminders of a night that had brought neither pleasure nor rest. But washing was a luxury. Water had to be fetched, heated, and used sparingly. Soap was costly, and laundry was done only once a week, sometimes less. To remove the gown each morning was to invite judgment. No one wanted to be seen scrubbing a garment that revealed what had taken place in bed. Modesty demanded concealment, and concealment demanded filth. The consequences came quietly. The damp fabric created a perfect environment for fungus and bacteria. Women developed itching, rashes, and sores that never fully healed. The friction of unwashed cloth against delicate skin caused inflammation that spread with each passing night. Doctors, when consulted, prescribed tonics or rest but never asked about hygiene. They saw the suffering without seeing the cause. In their eyes, the female body was naturally fragile, always prone to decay. If this were today, it would be like wearing the same gym clothes for weeks and wondering why the skin never heals. For poorer women, the situation was worse. Their night clothes were often their only clothes. They slept in the same garments they wore all day, soaked in sweat and kitchen smoke. There was no privacy, no fresh fabric to change into. Even if they wanted to wash, there was little water and no time. The odour of their bodies mixed with the smell of labour and poverty. What should have been rest became another form of discomfort, another reminder that cleanliness belonged only to those who could afford it. Among the wealthy, the illusion of refinement masked the same neglect. Silk gowns, lace collars, and perfumed sachets could not hide the reality beneath. The expensive fabrics trapped moisture even more efficiently. clinging to the skin and feeding infection under the pretense of elegance. Servants changed the sheets occasionally, but the nightclothes themselves were washed rarely, for handling such garments was considered indecent. The result was the same. No matter the class, women suffered in silence while men remained untouched by consequence. What lingered most was the feeling of confinement. The fabric was both barrier and burden, sealing in the residue of intimacy. A woman's body became her prison, wrapped in the traces of another's desire. Every movement reminded her of it. The faint tug of cloth between her legs, the sour smell when she bent down, the cool dampness that returned each night. She learned to ignore it, to fold her discomfort into routine, because speaking of it would mean admitting that such things existed at all. Religious modesty only deepened the cycle. The Church taught that a good wife did not indulge in worldly vanity, which included concern for her own comfort or cleanliness. To change too often, to care too much about her body, was seen as vanity. So she learned to bear the dirt with grace. In sermons, purity was spiritual, not physical, and suffering was a virtue. The irony was complete. Those who sought to remain pure in soul were left impure in flesh. I cannot help but feel that this quiet endurance was not holiness, but helplessness disguised as duty. By the time the week's wash arrived, the nightgown carried the history of many nights, each layer of stain, each faint trace of skin. It was washed roughly, often in cold water, never enough to remove the smell completely. The fabric aged quickly, becoming thin and grey, yet it was still worn until it tore. To discard it would mean waste, and waste was sin. The cloth remained, patched and faded, a silent witness to years of neglect. In the privacy of their rooms, some women tried to wipe themselves clean with scraps of cloth or the hem of a blanket. But these small acts were secret, almost shameful. They knew the risk of being discovered, of being accused of impropriety for tending to their own hygiene. So they continued the same ritual: lie still, dress again, sleep in what had been dirtied. Each morning, the gown was no longer a garment but a memory of what could not be spoken. The routine dulled the senses. The smell that once disgusted became familiar. The discomfort that once burned became numbness. It was not ignorance, but resignation. The understanding that nothing would change. To be clean was to be seen, and to be seen was to be judged. The silence around women's bodies was so thick that even decay had to hide behind lace and prayer. The Victorian nightgown became more than clothing. It was a symbol of suppression stitched in fabric. What should have been softness turned into confinement. What should have been rest turned into rot. The body beneath it grew weary, tired of serving, tired of waiting for care that never came. The habit of wearing the same soiled gown through night and day blurred the line between rest and decay. It turned the bed from a place of comfort into a quiet ground for infection. Yet under those heavy blankets, another practice waited, one that carried the same stains but was far more visible. The blanket was meant to keep them warm, but it had long become something else. Its surface told the story of nights layered upon nights, a mixture of fluids, sweat, and dust that hardened into a texture of quiet neglect. Each stain was familiar, left to dry and fade into the fabric as if time itself had accepted it. Washing the blanket was not a routine but a rare act, done only when the odour grew too strong to ignore. Until then, it remained part of the bed, part of the room, and part of life itself. It is almost absurd that something meant for comfort became a collector of decay. But in Victorian homes, that was not strange at all. In those dim bedrooms, the air grew thick. The smell of damp linen and old flesh clung to the walls and the wooden floor. The window stayed shut most of the time to keep the cold out, trapping every breath and trace of moisture inside. When the blanket was lifted, it released a faint cloud of dust mixed with the scent of human bodies. It was not just unwashed. It was alive with bacteria, mites and mould, thriving in the warmth where people slept and touched and sweated. The idea of hygiene was still primitive, and cleanliness was seen as a sign of vanity. Most families believed that too much washing weakened the body. Laundry took effort, water, and firewood, all too precious to waste on something as trivial as bedding. And so the blanket became permanent, like a second skin spread over the bed. Its fibres absorbed everything, from the sweetness of breath to the bitterness of infection. If we think about it now, it would be like sleeping under the same unwashed sheet for months, pretending that the smell is simply part of home. The mix of fluids was inevitable. Every act of intimacy left traces, thin, pale streaks that dried into patches of stiffness. Over time, they darkened, blending with stains of sweat and oil until the whole surface turned into a map of bodily history. The warmth of bodies revived the scent each night, turning it into what some might have called familiar. It was not pleasant, but it was constant, and constancy felt safer than change. In the stillness of marriage, filth became comfort. Servants, when they entered the rooms of their employers, pretended not to notice. In poorer homes, there were no servants to notice at all. The blankets lay heavy and damp, pressed against skin that no longer reacted to the texture of rot. Women slept closest to it, their backs against the same patches that never dried fully, their hair sometimes sticking to the fabric. The odour of sex and mould clung to their skin, making them feel less human, yet no one spoke of it. It was not indecency that silenced them, but exhaustion. The medical world did not concern itself with such things. When women developed rashes or chronic coughs from inhaling mould spores, it was called weakness of constitution. When infections followed, they were told to rest and pray. The link between cleanliness and health was not yet drawn in the minds of most Victorians. They feared the exposure to water more than the danger of filth. What mattered was keeping the bed made, not clean. The illusion of order outweighed the comfort of hygiene. Among wealthier families, the blankets were embroidered, perfumed, and wrapped in elegance. But beneath the lace and floral stitching, the same stains remained. Perfume mixed with decay until neither scent could be separated from the other. The bed looked proper, but the fabric carried the same history as in the houses of the poor. Cleanliness was a matter of sight, not of smell. What guests saw was beauty. What lingered beneath was corruption dressed in comfort. It is strange how even luxury can be reduced to filth when no one dares to lift the fabric. The emotional weight of the blanket was just as heavy. For many women, it symbolized duty rather than rest. It covered them during acts they did not choose, absorbed the traces of nights they would rather forget, and wrapped them again each morning like a silent witness. The fabric became part of the rhythm of submission, an object that held both intimacy and sorrow. The stains were not only physical, they were reminders of the quiet resignation that defined womanhood in that era. The combination of body fluids, damp air, and organic dust created a slow rot. Mould spread like a faint shadow under the surface, invisible until it ate through the threads. When the blanket finally tore, it was patched, never replaced. Each repair added another layer of history, a mixture of thrift and denial. By then, the smell had long become part of the household's identity. No one called it filth anymore. They called it home. In this way, the Victorian bedroom existed between comfort and decay. The blanket that once promised warmth became a silent participant in disease, intimacy, and shame. It held memories, absorbed secrets, and carried the scent of years spent pretending that nothing was wrong. The room remained still, the air unmoving, and the people within it continued to sleep beneath the weight of their own neglect. Every breath drawn under that blanket carried a trace of what had been done, what had been ignored, and what would be repeated again. It was not just fabric, it was a record of living bodies and dying habits. And as the nights passed, The warmth of the bed hid a growing truth. The closer the bodies slept, the more they shared the same slow, invisible rot. The blanket that was never washed became more than dirt. It became memory itself, thick and inescapable, binding the sleepers in their own history. What started as comfort turned into a quiet rot that filled both lungs and conscience, and beneath its weight, another kind of violation waited, one that carried the authority of medicine rather than marriage. There were moments when a visit to the doctor became far more dangerous than the sickness itself. In the dim examination rooms of the Victorian era, women were told to lie still and trust the man in the white coat. The word medical carried weight, a promise of authority and care. Yet behind that word often hid a quiet cruelty that no one dared to name. The examination was not always about illness, it was about control. It is bitterly ironic that a society obsessed with female virtue allowed doctors to be the first to violate it. Many women arrived frightened but obedient, sent by their husbands or mothers for vague complaints, pain in the stomach, fatigue, irregular bleeding. They were told these symptoms came from a restless womb, a wandering uterus that needed discipline. The cure was examination. Doctors spoke softly, in tones of authority, as if their hands were instruments of science rather than intrusion. Some used iron tools polished to a shine, others their bare fingers. None asked for permission. The room smelled of disinfectant and dust. The table was covered with a thin sheet, stiff and cold against the skin. A woman's dress had to be lifted, her legs positioned just so, her modesty stripped in the name of medicine. The moment the instrument entered her, the air shifted. It was sharp, foreign, and wrong. She clenched her hands, waiting for it to end, while the doctor murmured about anatomy as if she were not even there. Pain was dismissed as imagination. Tears were ignored. If this happened today, it would be called assault. But in the Victorian era, it was called examination. Virginity itself became a medical interest. The hymen was treated not as a part of the body, but as proof of morality. Doctors inspected it to verify a woman's purity, sometimes at the request of fathers or future husbands. The practice was justified as science, but performed with fascination and cruelty. When the thin membrane tore under cold fingers or metal instruments, the woman's innocence was gone in the eyes of her society, though she had done nothing at all. The damage was silent, the shame immediate, and the guilt entirely hers. What made it more unbearable was the silence that followed. No one spoke of these things. A woman could not accuse a doctor without being accused herself of indecency. To speak of the examination was to repeat the humiliation, to stain her own reputation further. So she buried it deep, beneath layers of propriety and fear, pretending that the pain was part of being a woman. Some went home and bled quietly. Others avoided doctors for the rest of their lives, carrying the memory as a private scar. The men who performed these examinations were respected, even admired. They wrote articles about the female body in medical journals, describing it as mysterious, unstable, and in need of supervision. They claimed to study women in order to protect them, but their words carried the same tone as ownership. Each examination was both curiosity and command, a way to remind women that their bodies did not belong to them. Even pain could be redefined if it served authority. The instruments themselves were brutal in design. Long metal speculums, wooden probes, and even glass tubes were inserted with little care. They were rarely cleaned properly, passed from one patient to another without sterilization. Infection spread easily, but blame never reached the clinic. Women who fell ill afterward were said to have delicate constitutions. If they screamed, they were hysterical. If they endured, they were brave. Either way, the doctor's hands remained innocent. There was a deep hypocrisy at the heart of it all. The same culture that condemned women for revealing an ankle in public allowed men to explore their most private parts without question. The language of morality and medicine blurred until neither could be separated. Modesty became submission, and submission became routine. The doctor's gaze replaced the husband's, turning the female body into a site of constant surveillance. Sometimes I wonder if they ever realized that what they called purity was built entirely on women's silence. Not all women remained silent, though their voices were faint. A few reformers began to question the ethics of these procedures. They spoke of unnecessary invasions, of humiliation disguised as science, yet they were dismissed as emotional, accused of misunderstanding the noble intentions of medicine. Their protests were drowned beneath the applause for progress and discovery. Every scandal was followed by reassurance, every accusation by another article praising the advancement of gynecology. By the end of the century, the damage was done. Generations of women had learned to fear the doctor's table more than the pain that brought them there. What was meant to heal had become another form of domination. Each cold touch reminded them of their powerlessness, each examination a rehearsal of submission. And when the door closed behind them, they walked back into a world that still demanded their silence, their virtue, and their trust. The Victorian obsession with control reached into every corner of a woman's body, even those hidden from view. The promise of health became a tool of conformity, and purity was measured by men who never had to prove their own. The body became a battlefield where medicine, morality, and shame collided. Beneath the surface of progress, suffering was methodical and accepted. The examinations that tore and silenced women were not accidents, but rituals of power repeated again and again. They left no headlines, only faint stains on white sheets and stronger walls around women's voices. And when the door of the clinic closed, another wound was sealed under the name of care, leading quietly to the next cruelty, one that would take place not in hospitals, but in the crowded homes where privacy no longer existed. The idea of privacy barely existed in the crowded homes of Victorian towns. Entire families slept in the same room, often on a single bed or a shared floor of straw and old blankets. Space was a privilege reserved for the rich. For everyone else, the night was an unavoidable intimacy, where bodies pressed close out of necessity rather than affection. Between the coughing of infants, the snoring of elders, and the creak of floorboards, life continued with no curtain to draw. It is grimly ironic that in an age obsessed with moral purity, even sin had no place to hide. When darkness came, so did the sound of bodies shifting under the same covers. Parents, too tired to wait or too desperate to care, carried out their marital duties beside the sleeping shapes of their children. The room was filled with the smell of sweat, damp air, and the faint sweetness of decay. The walls, when there were any, were thin enough for whispers and sighs to travel freely. Sometimes there was no separation at all, just a heavy blanket shared among too many. The children lay still, pretending to sleep, their eyes half open to shadows they did not understand. For those children, especially the girls, the experience left quite a mark that would never fade. They learned early that the body was something done to, not something owned. The sounds of their parents' exhaustion and pain became the rhythm of the night. Some turned their faces to the wall, pressing their hands over their ears, but the walls did not protect them. Others stared at the ceiling until morning, watching the faint play of candlelight and hearing the muffled breath of a world that gave them no choice but to witness. The poor had no rooms to spare. In city slums, a single apartment might hold a family of 6 or more. Lodging houses offered little more than a bed, sometimes shared by strangers who rotated by shifts. For many, the act of intimacy took place in silence and shadow, hurried and mechanical, with children a few feet away. It was not romance, not even desire, but duty done in the open air of poverty. The floor creaked, the bed moved, and the children learned to lie still. What began as a necessity became normality. If this were today, it would be like trying to keep secrets inside a room made entirely of glass. Mothers carried the weight of this shame more than anyone. They knew what their children heard, what they might have seen, and yet there was nothing to be done. To stop would be to deny their husbands. To speak of it would be indecent. So they folded the blankets tighter, whispering apologies that never reached anyone's ears. In the mornings, they swept the floor, washed their faces, and prepared breakfast, pretending the night had not happened. Their daughters watched, understanding without being told that silence was survival. In some homes, the boundaries blurred even further. Extended families lived together, grandparents, siblings, and sometimes lodgers. Privacy was traded for rent money. The act of sex, stripped of tenderness, became another sound among many, no different from the rattling of dishes or the fire's crackle. The air never cleared, the sheets never dried, and the smell of bodies never truly left. To the outside world, these homes were symbols of moral decay, but for those inside, they were simply what life demanded. Children raised in these rooms grew up too quickly. The unspoken knowledge of what they saw at night settled deep into their understanding of the world. Girls, especially, carried that knowledge into adulthood. Some repeated what they had witnessed, seeking affection through the only form of intimacy they knew. Others recoiled from touch entirely, equating closeness with fear. What was learned in silence became destiny, generation after generation. The church preached chastity and self-control, but its words did not reach the tenements. Sermons about modesty meant little to families who had no walls to divide them. Poverty turned virtue into a luxury. The same society that condemned moral weakness also created the conditions where privacy was impossible. It was not lust that filled those nights, but fatigue, hunger, and the desperate need to stay connected in a world that offered nothing else. For the children, the trauma lived quietly. It showed in the way they flinched at loud voices or avoided eye contact when intimacy was mentioned. It was passed down not through words but through silence, through habits and gestures. A mother's shame became a daughter's confusion. A father's exhaustion became a son's indifference. What began as an act between two people became the invisible inheritance of an entire family. Doctors and reformers who studied the poor often described these homes as dens of vice, blaming immorality for the conditions of poverty. They failed to see that it was poverty itself that stripped people of dignity. There was no perversion in survival, only consequence. The moralists spoke of sin while ignoring the real cause, the absence of space, of privacy, of choice. The body had no sanctuary and the soul had nowhere to hide. Even so, life went on. Children grew, parents aged, and the same rooms witnessed the same rituals year after year. The sounds of the night remained, softened by routine, normalized by exhaustion. The families stayed together under roofs that held both love and shame, never separating the two. To survive, they learned to forget, or at least to pretend forgetting was possible. In those cramped rooms, intimacy lost its meaning and became merely an act of endurance. What was supposed to unite people instead revealed how trapped they were within their own lives. The smallest children slept between their parents, the older ones turned away, and everyone carried the memory in silence. The house breathed as one, bound by poverty, bound by necessity, and bound by shame. The nights of shared beds and restless sleep were not born from desire, but from the simple absence of space. They created generations raised in the same confined air, shaped by the same sounds. And from that claustrophobic world, another cruelty would emerge, one quieter but far more personal, the kind that began with a man's hand and ended with a woman's silence. Consent was a concept that never reached most Victorian bedrooms. In those dim, airless rooms, the rhythm of intimacy followed a single direction, dictated by habit, religion, and authority. A woman's role was to be still, to accept, to perform her duty quietly. Her silence was mistaken for agreement, her stillness for virtue. The man acted, the woman endured, and both believed they were fulfilling the order of nature. It is almost comical, in the darkest way, how obedience was mistaken for affection. A woman who turned away, who hesitated, who said no, was not seen as tired or in pain, but as ungrateful. Her reluctance meant rebellion. Her refusal meant sin. Men spoke of marital rights as though they were sacred, a divine guarantee that their desires must be answered. The law agreed. There was no crime called marital rape because a wife's body was considered her husband's property. Even the church blessed this arrangement, preaching that a good woman must never deny her husband, lest she tempt him toward wickedness. Between scripture and custom, she lost ownership of her own skin. Night after night, the ritual repeated. The husband returned from work or drink, smelling of sweat, tobacco, and fatigue. His needs were never questioned. The wife waited, perhaps already asleep, perhaps pretending to be. The act began without words, without tenderness, without pause. Her body stiffened at first, then softened from resignation, not pleasure. It was easier to close her eyes and disappear than to resist. The bed became a stage for one performer and one audience forced to stay seated. If it happened today, we would call it violence, but in that time it was simply marriage. For many women, the pain became part of life. They bore it as they bore childbirth, menstruation, and grief, with quiet endurance. They were told that good wives did not seek satisfaction, that their virtue was measured by how little they desired. The less she wanted, the purer she was. In this way, morality taught women to detach from their own senses, to see pleasure as corruption. To want was dangerous. To feel was shameful. They were trained to erase themselves from their own experiences. The consequences stretched beyond the body. Women who resisted too often found themselves punished through coldness or cruelty. Some husbands withdrew affection, others withdrew support. A wife who displeased her husband risked losing her home, her status, and her children. And so, compliance became survival. The fear of rejection was stronger than the fear of pain. For those trapped in loveless marriages, intimacy was not a bond but a burden, a nightly reminder of how little their feelings mattered. In wealthier homes, the same story unfolded behind thicker curtains. The language was softer, the surroundings more polished, but the rules remained. Women wore silk gowns instead of rags, but their bodies were no freer. Doctors, priests, and mothers all gave the same advice. Be patient, be gentle, be quiet. The silence passed from one generation to the next, like an heirloom no one wanted but everyone carried. The daughters of such women grew up believing that love meant endurance. Outside the bedroom, men discussed women as though they were children, delicate, emotional, incapable of rational choice. The idea that a woman could have desire or boundaries was seen as absurd. If she spoke of pleasure, she was obscene. If she asked for rest, she was cold. No matter what she did, she failed. It was a game rigged from the start, and the cost of playing was her dignity. The few who spoke up were branded hysterical, a word men used to make madness sound feminine. Once labelled, their words lost value and their pain was dismissed as delusion. The emotional silence that followed was suffocating. Many women stopped thinking of their bodies as their own. They performed the role expected of them, and afterward lay still, staring into the dark ceiling, counting the seconds until it ended. The body healed from the bruises, but the mind learned to retreat further each time. Intimacy became a form of absence, a hollow exchange repeated until the self disappeared completely. I sometimes think the tragedy was not that they were forced, but that they were convinced it was right. Religion wrapped this cruelty in holiness. The Church's sermons painted obedience as love, submission as grace. Wives were told their suffering brought them closer to God, that endurance was their sacred duty. Even pain became a virtue. The more they bore, the purer they became. It was a system built to sanctify power, not compassion. Under that weight, a woman's body became both altar and sacrifice, and no one questioned the ritual. Over time, the distinction between consent and duty vanished altogether. Men did not need to ask, and women did not think they could refuse. The act was stripped of its humanity and left as a mechanical routine, a chore disguised as closeness. It bred resentment, confusion, and quiet despair, all kept hidden beneath the same unwashed sheets that had witnessed everything else. The home, celebrated as the heart of virtue, became instead the place where virtue demanded silence. This pattern shaped not just marriages but generations. Daughters learned their mother's stillness. Sons inherited their father's entitlement. What began in one bed spread through entire societies until silence itself became a moral expectation. Those who suffered within it believed they were alone, but in truth, nearly every home carried the same quiet tragedy. The cruelty was not personal, it was cultural. The absence of consent was not born of hatred, but of blindness. It thrived in a world where emotion was weakness, where kindness was seen as indulgence. Men did not see themselves as cruel, women did not see themselves as victims, and that illusion made it all the more unbreakable. The cycle continued, quiet and consistent, until it no longer needed enforcement. It became instinct. The Victorian marriage bed was not a place of union, but of erasure. Every night it repeated the same lie, that love required silence, and silence meant peace. But beneath that stillness, resentment grew, slow and poisonous, waiting for the smallest spark to expose how fragile obedience truly was. The act done without asking became the foundation of countless homes, turning devotion into duty and affection into debt. And from that numbness would rise something darker still, where violation no longer even pretended to be love, only invention, and the instruments of that invention would leave wounds far worse than words. The pursuit of pleasure was not always born from desire. Sometimes it came from loneliness. In the secret corners of Victorian homes, where silence ruled and shame was constant, women sought ways to reclaim even the faintest sense of control over their own bodies. There were no safe objects made for them, no knowledge to guide them, only whispers and improvisation. What followed was a quiet desperation, hidden beneath the lace and dim candlelight. It is both tragic and darkly ironic that a society obsessed with modesty drove women to injure themselves in the search for relief. Some experimented with what they found at hand: wooden handles, ivory brushes, bits of metal or glass. They sanded them roughly, believing smoothness could be achieved with fabric and oil. But every edge carried risk, every surface held unseen danger. Splinters tore through soft skin, metals corroded from use, and glass cracked under pressure. The body became both the subject and the victim of its own rebellion. There was no instruction, only curiosity mixed with fear. When electricity began to enter homes, it offered a new temptation. Early vibrating devices were marketed as medical aids for women's nervous conditions, promising to restore calm and feminine balance. But these crude machines were unregulated, their cords frayed, their casings uninsulated. Some sparked mid-use, sending jolts that burned or numbed the flesh. The users never told anyone. They cleaned the blood, hid the burns, and went about their day as if nothing had happened. Pain was easier to endure than shame. The silence surrounding these injuries was absolute. Women could not go to doctors, for to do so meant confessing an act of indecency. Even in agony, they were trapped by the same moral codes that had denied them pleasure in the first place. Infection set in quietly, turning discomfort into fever, fever into collapse. And when some of them died, their deaths were attributed to female weakness, a phrase that disguised both cruelty and ignorance. If it happened in our time, it would be like treating broken glass as medicine and calling the wounds accidental. Men, too, were often unaware or uninterested in these hidden injuries. The subject was forbidden. To speak of it was to ruin one's reputation. And so, women suffered alone, their attempts at comfort turning into acts of harm. Their bodies told stories they could never speak, each scar a mark of the suffocating rules that governed them. They lived in a world where even the smallest attempt at bodily autonomy became self-destruction. The tools themselves, when found, were sometimes mistaken for curiosities. Medical journals recorded them as evidence of hysteria or depravity, never compassion. Doctors wrote in detached tones about unusual objects discovered in the female cavity, listing materials as if they were cataloguing insects. There was no empathy in those pages, only fascination. Each case ended with the same phrase, "patient expired from infection." It is haunting to imagine these women, alone in the dim light of their bedrooms, their faces tense with fear, their hands trembling around what they hoped might offer comfort. No one taught them pleasure, no one permitted them to seek it safely. They were told that desire was sin and pain was virtue. But the human body, even under repression, still remembered its hunger for touch, its instinct to feel. That conflict between nature and morality created wounds that no law, no prayer, no medicine could heal. As time passed, the shame remained stronger than knowledge. Even when the 20th century brought progress, the silence of those earlier years lingered. Their suffering was buried under the image of the pure Victorian woman, pale, composed, untouchable. History forgot the blood on the floorboards, the infections that began as curiosity, the women who died unnamed because they tried to know themselves. What the world called purity was built on their erasure. The tragedy of the Victorian bedroom was not only in its acts of control, but in its aftermath. The women left behind, unseen and unspoken, who tried to reclaim what was never freely given. Their attempts at liberation turned against them, their pain transformed into proof of their supposed frailty. And yet, in a way, their defiance survived. Each quiet attempt to feel, each hidden moment of rebellion, was a small spark against centuries of silence. I can't help but feel that even in their pain, there was a kind of resistance, fragile but real, a whisper that the body still belonged to them. The story of these homemade instruments closes the long circle of hypocrisy that defined Victorian intimacy. From poisoned perfumes to forced obedience, from medical intrusion to private mutilation, every act shared the same root, a system that feared women's bodies and sought to control them. But beneath all the suffering, there was endurance, and endurance, even silent, is its own form of rebellion. The world that silenced them is gone now, but its echoes remain. We still inherit their lessons, the dangers of ignorance, the cruelty of shame, and the cost of moral pretense. To remember them is to break that silence, to give back the voices that history denied. And so, if your eyes grow heavy now, let them rest knowing that even in the darkest times, there were women who dared, who suffered, and who survived in defiance of the world that sought to erase them. May their quiet strength bring you peace tonight. Sleep softly, and let the noise of the past fade into silence. Good night.